The small town of Gori sat in the shadow of the Caucasus Mountains, a place of hot, dusty summers and biting alpine winters. Here, the Russian Empire felt distant, yet its heavy hand was omnipresent. In a small, one-room brick hut with a dirt floor and a leaking roof, Iosif Dzhugashvili was born in December 1878. The air inside the home was permanently thick with the sharp smell of cheap tobacco, damp wool, and the sour scent of spilled alcohol. His mother, Ekaterina, known to everyone as Kik, was a deeply religious woman born into a family of serfs. She had already buried 2 sons, Mikhail and Georgy, who died in infancy. Iosif was her 3rd child, her only survivor, and she looked upon him as a literal miracle from God. She fiercely vowed that this boy would live, no matter the cost, and that he would rise far above the miserable poverty of Gori. His father, Bessarion, known as Bissot, was a shoemaker. At one time, Bissot had been a respected craftsman with his own workshop in Tiflis, but the rise of modern factory-made footwear ruined his business. He was forced to move back to Gori to work in a larger factory, a shift that broke his pride. Bissot turned heavily to the bottle. He spent his meager earnings on fiery Georgian wine and cheap vodka, returning home late at night with a boiling, unpredictable rage. For young Iosif, home was not a sanctuary. It was a minefield. The boy quickly learned to read the heavy, unsteady footsteps of his father outside the wooden door. When Bissot was drunk, the slightest thing could trigger a beating. He beat Kik savagely, and he beat Iosif with equal cruelty. During these assaults, Bissot would lift the boy by his arms and throw him hard against the dirt floor, or strike him across the face with heavy leather straps. The violence was so frequent and intense that it left a permanent impression on the boy's worldview. He learned very early that the world was divided into the powerful who struck blows and the weak who received them. He determined that he would not remain among the weak. One evening, the violence escalated to a dangerous peak. Bissot attacked Kik so violently that the young Iosif, terrified but furious, lunged at his father with a small kitchen knife to protect his mother. The boy was thrown aside, but the message was clear. The household was a war zone. Eventually, Kik took her son and left Bissot, moving between rented rooms and the homes of sympathetic relatives. Bissot left for Tiflis entirely, abandoning his family financially but occasionally returning like a ghost to demand that his son drop out of school to become a cobbler like him. Kik refused. She washed clothes, scrubbed floors, and took on sewing work for wealthy local families, destroying her own health to pay for her son's education. Physical pain was not limited to his father's hands. When Iosif was roughly 7 years old, a terrifying epidemic of smallpox swept through the crowded, unhygienic streets of Gori. The disease killed dozens of local children, and soon Iosif fell ill. For days, he burned with a high fever, his skin erupting in painful, fluid-filled pustules. Kik sat by his bedside, praying constantly and applying wet cloths to his burning forehead. The boy survived, but the disease left its permanent mark. When the scabs finally fell away, his face was deeply pitted and scarred with pockmarks. For the rest of his life, he would remain deeply self-conscious about these scars. In later years, he would order official state photographs to be heavily airbrushed to hide the damage left by the Gori epidemic. The smallpox did not just scar his skin, it reinforced his sense of isolation. He felt marked, different from the other children, and he withdrew further into a protective shell of silence and watchful suspicion. Not long after surviving smallpox, another disaster struck. While walking down a narrow street in Gori, Iosif was knocked down by a speeding, horse-drawn carriage. The heavy wheels ran over his left arm, fracturing the bones and severely damaging the muscles and tendons. In the 19th century Caucasus, medical care for poor children was rudimentary at best. The bones healed poorly. The arm grew back slightly shorter than the right one, and the elbow joint became permanently stiff. He could never fully straighten the arm or lift heavy objects with it. The physical deformity was a massive blow to a young boy in a culture that valued physical strength, warrior bravado, and street fighting. He had to learn to compensate for his physical limitations with mental sharpness, intense willpower, and a calculated, patient malice. Despite his physical setbacks, Iosif proved to be exceptionally intelligent. Keek used all her connections, especially with a local priest named Christopher Charkviany, to get her son enrolled in the Gori Church School in 1888. The school was a strict institution run by the Russian Orthodox Church. Its primary goal was to assimilate Georgian children into the Russian Empire, a process known as Russification. The teachers strictly forbade the students from speaking their native Georgian language. If a boy was caught speaking Georgian in the corridors or playground, he was severely punished, humiliated, and forced to wear a humiliating placard around his neck. This environment forced Iosif to adapt quickly. He possessed a sharp memory and a natural gift for language. He mastered Russian quickly, speaking it fluently, though he would retain a heavy, distinct Georgian accent for the rest of his life. He became the top student in his class, excelling in reading, geography, and church history. He also discovered he had a beautiful, clear singing voice. He joined the church choir and was soon chosen as the lead soloist, singing complex liturgical hymns during Sunday services. The locals who watched the pockmarked boy with the stiff arm sing like an angel had no idea of the dark, cold anger building inside him. School also gave him an escape from his bleak domestic reality. He became a voracious reader, consuming every book he could find. He loved old Georgian legends of mountain bandits and romantic rebels who fought against injustice. He was particularly captivated by a novel titled The Patricide by the Georgian writer Alexander Kazbegi. The book featured a heroic, stoic mountain outlaw named Koba, who fought against corrupt imperial officials to protect his people. Koba was fierce, completely loyal to his friends, absolutely merciless to his enemies, and unaffected by physical hardship. The young Iosif completely identified with this character. He demanded that his classmates call him Koba. He absorbed the fictional rebel's traits into his own developing personality, using the name as a shield against his vulnerability. As Iosif approached his teenage years, the divide between him and his father grew wider. Bissot returned to Gori periodically, furious that his son was wasting time learning Latin, Russian, and theology instead of earning money at a cobbler's bench. On one occasion, Bissot legally kidnapped the boy and took him to Tiflis, forcing him to work in the Adelkhanov shoe factory, cleaning leather and running errands for minimal pay. Keek fought back fiercely. She traveled to Tiflis, utilized the influence of her church contacts, and dragged her son back to school. Bissot eventually washed his hands of the boy entirely, slipping further into chronic alcoholism until he died in a squalid hospital brawl years later. Iosif did not attend his father's funeral. The only father he had ever known was a source of terror, and its removal left him with no respect for traditional authority. By 1894, Iosif had completed his studies at the Gori Church School at the top of his class. He was 15 years old, highly intelligent, deeply scarred both physically and emotionally, and intensely ambitious. He had successfully navigated a childhood characterized by extreme poverty, domestic violence, near-fatal illnesses, and imperial discrimination. He had learned to hide his true thoughts behind an impassive, unreadable facial expression. He knew how to survive, how to manipulate his peers, and how to win the favor of powerful adults when necessary. Keek was overjoyed by his academic success. Her lifelong dream was finally within reach. Her only son was going to become an Orthodox priest. This path would guarantee him a life of comfort, respect, and high social standing, far away from the dirt floors and violence of Gori. She secured a scholarship for him at the prestigious Tiflis Theological Seminary, the highest institution of learning in Georgia. In the late summer of 1894, Iosif packed his few belongings into a small wooden box and boarded a carriage bound for Tiflis. As the dusty town of Gori faded into the distance behind him, the young boy left behind the world of the cobbler's son. He was entering a larger, far more dangerous world. The strict religious discipline of the seminary was designed to produce loyal servants of the Russian Tsar. Instead, the emotional armor Iosif had forged in the violent streets of his childhood would find a new, radical purpose. The church expected a priest, but the empire was about to receive a revolutionary. The carriage rolled into Tiflis in the sweltering late summer of 1894, carrying 15-year-old Iosif Dzhugashvili away from his childhood in Gori. Tiflis was a chaotic, crowded city where medieval Asia met imperial Russia. Camel caravans from Persia shared the dusty streets with European carriages, and opulent mansions of oil barons stood just blocks away from squalid, overcrowded slums. For a boy from a provincial town, the scale of the city was immense, but Iosif was not there to explore. He reported directly to his new home, the Tiflis Theological Seminary, a massive, gloomy stone building that resembled a fortress or a prison. For his mother Kik, this was the ultimate victory. Her son had secured a scholarship to the most prestigious school in Georgia. To her, those stone walls represented safety, respect, and a holy calling. But to the young Iosif, who still answered to his childhood nickname Koba, the seminary immediately felt like an occupying army's barracks. The seminary was run by Russian monks who viewed their Georgian students with deep suspicion. The Russian Empire was terrified of nationalist rebellion, and the monks functioned more as police officers and spies than as spiritual mentors. The rector, a strict monk named Dmitri, established an atmosphere of absolute control. The rules were rigid, designed to crush any spark of individuality or independent thought. The daily routine was punishing. The boys were woken at the crack of dawn by a heavy, clanging iron bell. They had to dress quickly in their uniform cassocks, line up for morning prayers, and endure hours of tedious religious services before eating a meager breakfast of stale bread and thin tea. The classrooms were cold, and the teaching style relied entirely on rote memorization. Students were forced to memorize pages of liturgical texts, Church Slavonic grammar, and theological doctrines. Any hesitation during recitation resulted in immediate punishment, confinement to solitary cells, deprivation of food, or public humiliation. The monks maintained a pervasive system of surveillance. They wore soft leather shoes so they could walk silently down the corridors, listening at doors and catching students whispering in their native Georgian. They regularly searched the students' private lockers, tore open their mattresses, and read their personal letters. Every infraction was recorded in a thick ledger known as the Black Book. Initially, Iosif adapted well, just as he had in Gori. His sharp mind and excellent memory made it easy for him to stay ahead of the monks' demands. He remained a star pupil, earning high marks in scripture, church history, and singing. He possessed a beautiful, clear voice, and he was chosen to sing in the seminary choir at the Grand Tiflis Cathedral. When important church officials visited, the pockmarked boy with the stiff left arm was often brought forward to recite complex passages or lead the hymns. During his first 2 years, Iosif also explored his creative side. He wrote romantic, lyrical poetry in Georgian, celebrating the majestic mountains, the beauty of the countryside, and the heroic past of his homeland. He even managed to get several of his poems published in a respected local Georgian newspaper under the initials I. Dzhshvili. One of his poems, dedicated to a famous Georgian poet, became quite popular among local nationalists and was eventually included in school anthologies. For a brief moment, it seemed Iosif might become a man of letters. But beneath the surface of the model student, a dark resentment was growing. The systematic humiliation of Georgian culture by the Russian monks deeply offended his pride. He watched as his classmates were publicly shamed just for reading Georgian books or speaking their mother tongue. The hypocrisy of the monks, who preached Christian charity but practiced psychological cruelty, disgusted him. He began to see the church not as a path to God, but as a giant machine designed to keep people submissive to the Tsar. By 1896, the world outside the seminary walls was bleeding in. Tiflis was becoming a hotbed of radical politics. Secret printing presses were producing illegal pamphlets, and railroad workers were organizing strikes. The seminary students, despite being locked inside their fortress, began to smuggle in forbidden ideas. The turning point for Iosif came when he discovered the Cheap Library, a local bookstore run by a man sympathetic to radical students. Iosif began spending his small allowance on books that were strictly banned by the seminary administration. He read translated works of Western science and philosophy, including Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. Darwin's theories shattered his remaining religious faith. If humans evolved from primates through a brutal struggle for survival, then the creation stories he was forced to memorize were myths, and the power of the Tsar was not ordained by God. From science, Iosif quickly moved to social critique. He read the novels of Victor Hugo and the works of Russian radical thinkers, but the text that truly electrified him was Karl Marx's Das Kapital. Marx provided a systematic, scientific explanation for the misery Iosif had witnessed his entire life. It argued that human history was driven not by divine will, but by class struggle, the eternal conflict between the rich oppressors and the poor oppressed. For a boy who had grown up watching his mother scrub floors while his father was destroyed by poverty, Marxism made perfect sense. It offered a diagnosis of the world's cruelty and a promise that the oppressed would eventually overthrow their masters. Iosif completely abandoned his poetry and his aspirations for the priesthood. He converted to Marxism with the absolute fervor of a religious fanatic. He traded the theology of the Orthodox Church for the dogma of the proletarian revolution. Inside the seminary, Iosif became a leader of a secret Marxist circle. He and a small group of trusted classmates would gather in the dark corners of the seminary cellars, or hidden behind stacks of wood in the courtyard, to read and discuss illegal pamphlets. They took turns keeping watch for the silent approach of the monks. Under the dim light of a single candle, Iosif would explain Marx's theories to his fellow students. The skills he had learned as a top student, his ability to memorize, structure arguments, and speak clearly, made him a compelling teacher. But his style was different from the emotional, romantic student radicals of the era. Iosif was calm, precise, and completely unsentimental. The seminary inspectors soon realized they were losing control of the pockmarked Georgian boy. The Black Book began to fill with entries detailing Iosif's defiance. The monks noted that he was repeatedly caught reading forbidden literature in the study halls. When confronted, Iosif did not cry or apologize. He simply stared back at the inspectors with an impassive, unreadable expression that infuriated them. One entry in the logbook by a monk named Murakov noted, Dzhugeshvili was caught reading a forbidden book, namely Hugo's Toilers of the Sea. He showed disrespect when the book was confiscated. Another entry described him as insolent and disrespectful towards the school authorities. The monks began punishing him systematically, placing him in the damp, freezing isolation cell for days at a time on a diet of bread and water. But the cell did not break him. It only hardened his resolve and deep-seated hatred for authority. The physical hardships reminded him of the outlaw Koba, the fictional hero he still strove to emulate. By 1898, Iosif had established contact with real revolutionaries outside the school walls. He joined Mesamedasi, the third group, the first Georgian social democratic organization. He began leading secret Marxist study circles for adult workers in the Tiflis railway shops and tobacco factories. He would sneak out of the seminary at night, scaling the high stone walls or bribing the guards, to meet with tough, grimy workers in the slums of the city. He felt far more at home in these smoke-filled shacks than in the incense-laden air of the seminary chapel. Living a double life took a severe toll on his academic performance. He skipped classes, refused to take his theology exams, and openly mocked the religious rituals. He wanted out, and the seminary administration wanted him gone. The final break occurred in May 1899. The official school record states that Iosif Dzhugashvili was expelled for failing to appear for his final examinations. When the heavy wooden doors of the Tiflis seminary slammed shut behind him for the last time, 20-year-old Iosif possessed no money, no degree, and no profession. His mother's heart was broken. Her dreams of seeing her son in a golden priest's robe were shattered. She would never truly understand his choice, but Iosif did not care about the priesthood anymore. He had spent 5 years inside the seminary learning how an autocracy functions. He had learned how to operate in the shadows, how to organize secret networks, and how to survive psychological warfare. He entered the fortress as a religious schoolboy from the provinces. He walked out into the streets of Tiflis as a hardened, godless revolutionary, ready to take his radical ideas into the dangerous underworld of the political struggle. Leaving the stone fortress of the Tiflis seminary behind, 20-year-old Iosif Dzhugashvili stepped into the sunlight of a completely uncertain future. He had no money, no home, and no profession. To his deeply religious mother, he was a failure who had thrown away a lifetime of security. To the Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, he was another radical student to keep an eye on. But Iosif felt a sense of absolute liberation. He was no longer bound by the tedious rules of the monks or the expectations of a traditional life. He discarded his civilian identity and fully adopted his underground alias, Koba. To survive and keep his independence, Koba took a job at the Tiflis Physical Observatory as a clerk and meteorologist. It was a modest job that paid a tiny salary, but it provided him with 2 essential things: a quiet room to sleep in and a perfect cover for his real work. While he spent his days recording temperatures, wind speeds, and atmospheric pressure, his nights were dedicated entirely to the underground Marxist movement. Koba quickly realized that the educated, middle-class intellectuals who led the local socialist groups spent too much time debating abstract theories in comfortable salons. Koba had no patience for endless debates. He wanted action. He focused his energy on the poorest, most dangerous districts of Tiflis, the smoky, chaotic railway workshops and the squalid shoe factories, where thousands of workers labored for miserable wages under brutal conditions. He proved to be a master organizer. He spoke to the workers not as an arrogant student looking down from above, but as a peer who had grown up with the smell of cheap leather and the reality of domestic poverty. He kept his speeches short, simple, and direct. He did not use complex philosophical jargon. Instead, he used clear analogies, often borrowing the structured, repetitive tone of church sermons he had mastered at the seminary to hammer home a single, powerful message. The workers produced all the wealth, the capitalists stole it, and only a coordinated strike could smash the system. By 1900, Koba had successfully organized several small strikes and a massive, illegal May Day demonstration in the heart of Tiflis. Hundreds of workers marched through the streets carrying red banners, clashing violently with the Tsarist police and Cossacks. The Okhrana immediately took notice. They realized that a highly organized, shadowy figure was pulling the strings behind the growing labor unrest. In March 1901, the police raided the Tiflis observatory, tearing apart Koba's room in search of illegal literature. Koba, warned just in time by a sympathetic lookout, slipped out the back door as the police entered the front. From that moment on, he was a ghost. He had no permanent address, no legal papers, and spent every night sleeping on the floors of different workers' shacks. The party leadership saw his talent and ruthlessness and sent him to the black, oil-soaked city of Batumi on the Black Sea coast. If Tiflis was chaotic, Batumi was an industrial hellscape. It was a booming port city dominated by massive oil refineries, owned by incredibly wealthy families like the Rothschilds and the Nobels. Thousands of desperate, uneducated peasants from the countryside flooded the city to work in the refineries, living in filthy, overcrowded wooden barracks that floated in pools of toxic oil mud. Koba arrived in Batumi in November 1901 under the guise of a simple commercial agent. He immediately went to work. He set up a secret, illegal printing press in a tiny, rented cottage out in the marshes, operating it late at night by the light of shaded oil lamps. He printed thousands of leaflets exposing the horrific working conditions, the long hours, and the frequent workplace accidents at the refineries. In early 1902, a fire broke out at the massive Rothschild refinery, killing several workers. The management refused to compensate the families, sparking widespread anger. Koba seized the moment. He organized a series of escalating strikes that paralyzed the entire oil industry of Batumi. When the authorities arrested the strike leaders, Koba did not retreat. He organized a massive, furious march of over 3,000 workers to the local prison, demanding their release. The imperial troops panicked and opened fire into the dense crowd. Over a dozen workers were shot dead, and many more were wounded. The standard romantic radicals were horrified by the bloodshed, but Koba saw it as an ideological victory. The bullets of the Tsarist soldiers had proven his point better than any pamphlet ever could. The state was the enemy of the people. He organized a massive public funeral for the fallen workers, turning it into another fiery political demonstration. The Okhrana threw all their resources into catching him. In April 1902, Koba was finally betrayed by an informant and arrested during a secret party meeting. He was thrown into the grim Batumi prison, where he spent over a year locked in a small, damp cell. Prison would break many men, but for Koba, it was simply an extension of the seminary and his violent childhood. He adapted instantly. He maintained an icy, absolute self-control, refusing to speak to the interrogators or show any sign of weakness. He spent his time exercising in his cell, reading whatever books he could smuggle in, and organizing political prisoners to protest against the guards. In the autumn of 1903, the Tsarist government sentenced him to 3 years of exile in eastern Siberia. He was sent under armed guard to the remote, freezing village of Novaya Yuda, deep in the snow-covered forests of Irkutsk. The journey took months, traveling by rattling trains and horse-drawn sleds through temperatures so cold that breath turned to ice instantly. The government believed that the vast, empty distances of Siberia would swallow the young radical entirely. They severely underestimated his willpower. Koba stayed in Novaya Yuda for less than 2 months. The freezing cold and isolation did not depress him. It merely bored him. He wanted to be back in the fight. In January 1904, using a forged passport and a heavy winter coat provided by local sympathizers, he slipped away from his guards in the middle of a blinding blizzard. He walked miles through the deep snow to the nearest railway station, boarded a train heading west, and successfully escaped back to the Caucasus. When he returned to Tiflis, he found the Marxist movement deeply divided. While he was away in Siberia, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party had split into two warring factions. The Mensheviks, who favored a broad, moderate democratic party, and the Bolsheviks, led by a brilliant, uncompromising exile named Vladimir Lenin, who demanded a tight, highly disciplined cadre of professional revolutionaries. Koba did not hesitate. He read Lenin's pamphlets and recognized a kindred spirit, a man who valued absolute discipline, hated compromise, and viewed politics as total warfare. Koba became a dedicated Bolshevik. The next few years were a whirlwind of violence and underground conspiracy. The year 1905 brought a massive, empire-wide revolution against the Tsar. Across Russia, workers went on strike. Sailors mutinied and peasants burned down the estates of noblemen. In Georgia, Koba organized armed combat detachments. He procured weapons, organized protection rackets against wealthy businessmen, and ordered the assassination of police officials, spies, and political rivals. He became the undisputed boss of the Bolshevik underground in the Caucasus. But revolutions are incredibly expensive. Lenin and the central Bolshevik leadership, living in comfortable exile in Switzerland and France, desperately needed funds to buy weapons and print newspapers. They explicitly called for expropriations, a polite revolutionary term for armed bank robberies. Koba was more than happy to oblige. He was not a man for theoretical debates. He excelled at logistics and direct operations. The culmination of his underground career occurred on a bright summer morning in June 1907 in the center of Tiflis. A heavy stagecoach carrying an enormous shipment of state funds was driving through the crowded public square, escorted by heavily armed Cossacks on horseback. Koba had spent weeks meticulously planning the operation. He had placed his elite combat group, a gang of ruthless revolutionaries led by his eccentric childhood friend Kamo, at strategic points around the busy square. At a precise signal, the revolutionaries hurled massive, homemade bombs into the square. The explosions were deafening, shattering windows for blocks, throwing horses into the air, and instantly killing dozens of guards and innocent bystanders. In the utter chaos, as thick white smoke filled the square, Kamo and his men rushed the stagecoach, grabbed the sacks filled with hundreds of thousands of rubles, and vanished into the labyrinth of back alleys before the military could respond. It was one of the most audacious, spectacular, and bloody bank robberies in history. Koba himself did not throw a bomb. He stood at a safe distance, calmly watching the execution of his plan from the shadows. The Tiflis bank heist cemented his reputation within the highest circles of the Bolshevik Party. He had proven that he was not just a theorist who wrote articles from the safety of European cafes. He was a man of action who could deliver massive sums of money, completely indifferent to the human cost or the blood spilled in the process. He had fully transformed from the ambitious seminary student into a cold, efficient, and deeply feared operative of the underground. The spectacular violence of the 1907 Tiflis bank robbery made Koba a legend within the Bolshevik underground, but it also made him the most hunted man in the Russian Empire. The Tsarist secret police, furious at the public humiliation, flooded the Caucasus with spies and informants. The relative safety of his Georgian homeland vanished. For the next 5 years, Koba lived a frantic, nomadic existence, constantly changing his appearance, using forged passports, and moving between the oil fields of Baku and the hidden safe houses of St. Petersburg. He was arrested, exiled, and escaped multiple times, spinning in a dizzying cycle of prison cells and daring escapes. But by 1912, the iron net of the Okhrana finally tightened for good. The state grew tired of his regular escapes and decided to send him so far away that return would be functionally impossible. Koba was sentenced to a lengthy term of internal exile in the deepest, most isolated wilderness of northern Siberia, the Cherkassk region, a vast expanse of frozen tundra and dense taiga forests located just below the Arctic Circle. The journey to his destination took months and tested the absolute limits of human endurance. Bound in heavy iron chains, Koba was marched alongside columns of hardened criminals and political prisoners. They traveled by slow, freezing prison trains to the edge of the civilization, and then boarded wooden barges that moved slowly down the massive, ice-choked Yenisei River. The further north they traveled, the more the world disappeared. The cities turned into small towns, the towns turned into tiny wooden villages, and eventually there was nothing left but a vast, silent ocean of snow and trees. His final destination was Kureka, a tiny, desolate settlement consisting of only a few wooden log huts dug into the frozen earth. The village was inhabited by a handful of indigenous hunters and fishermen who lived on the absolute margins of survival. In Kureka, the climate was an active enemy. For more than half the year, the landscape was buried under deep snow drifts, and the temperature regularly plunged to an astonishing -50 degrees. During the peak of winter, the sun never rose at all. The world was trapped in a perpetual freezing twilight that drove many men to madness or suicide. For an energetic, ambitious revolutionary who had spent his entire life in the crowded streets, bustling oil refineries, and intense political meetings of the South, the isolation of Kureka was a psychological death sentence. There were no political meetings here. There were no workers to organize, no printing presses to run, and no banks to rob. He was completely cut off from the outside world. Letters from the party leadership in Europe took months to arrive, often showing up heavily censored, water-damaged, and long after the events they discussed had passed. Koba was assigned to live in a small, low-ceilinged room inside a wooden hut shared with a local peasant family. The air inside the hut was permanently thick with the suffocating smell of drying fish, wet dog fur, wood smoke, and unwashed bodies. His daily life became a monotonous, primitive struggle against starvation and the biting cold. To survive, the urban revolutionary had to learn the skills of a wilderness survivalist. He learned how to cut through thick river ice to set fishing lines, how to construct wooden traps to catch small forest animals for meat, and how to chop massive amounts of firewood to keep from freezing to death in his sleep. The physical isolation was compounded by a profound, crushing loneliness. For a brief period, another prominent Bolshevik intellectual, Yakov Sverdlov, was exiled to the same region and shared a cabin with Koba. In theory, the two men should have found comfort in each other's company, sharing their passion for Marxist theory and their hatred for the Tsar. But the opposite happened. Sverdlov was a refined, highly educated intellectual who valued cleanliness, intellectual debate, and structured living. Koba, hardened by his violent childhood and the rough life of the oil fields, was coarse, moody, and deeply unsocial. The two men quickly grew to despise each other. Koba refused to clean up after himself, left his dirty fishing gear all over the shared table, and withdrew into a hostile, brooding silence. Sverdlov later wrote in letters to his sister that Koba had become completely impossible to live with, describing him as an intensely bitter, self-absorbed man who refused to engage in normal human conversation. The tension became so unbearable that Sverdlov eventually begged the local authorities to move him to a different village, leaving Koba completely alone in his icy isolation. It was during these dark, frozen years of absolute isolation that a fundamental transformation took place within his identity. The old nickname, Koba, the romantic, hot-blooded Georgian mountain bandit who fought for justice, no longer fit the man he was becoming. He was no longer a youth driven by romantic notions of rebellion. The endless Siberian winters, the biting cold, and the total lack of human warmth burned away whatever remaining fragments of sentimentality he possessed. He needed a name that reflected his absolute detachment, his unyielding willpower, and his cold, calculating approach to human affairs. He began signing his political articles and rare letters with a new pseudonym, Stalin, the Man of Steel. While Stalin was freezing in Kurika, the world outside was exploding into chaos. In the summer of 1914, the First World War broke out. The Russian Empire mobilized millions of peasants and workers to fight against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Initially, Stalin watched the conflict from afar with a mixture of frustration and intense calculation. He read the scarce, outdated newspapers that arrived in Kurika, tracking the movements of the armies. He saw that the war was a catastrophic meat grinder for Russia. Millions of soldiers were being killed, the economy was collapsing, bread lines were forming in the major cities, and the absolute incompetence of the Tsarist government was being exposed on a massive scale. From his wooden hut near the Arctic Circle, Stalin recognized that Lenin's predictions were coming true. Lenin had long argued that the imperialist war must be turned into a civil war, that the suffering of the soldiers and workers would eventually drive them to turn their weapons against their own rulers. Stalin desperately wanted to be in Petrograd or Moscow to help guide the coming explosion, but he was trapped, powerless, watching the historical wheel turn from the absolute edge of the earth. In late 1916, as the Russian military ran desperately short of manpower due to staggering losses at the front, the government took an extraordinary step. They ordered the conscription of political exiles. Stalin was ordered to report to the town of Krasnoyarsk for a military medical examination. For the first time in years, he boarded a sled and traveled hundreds of miles south, leaving the desolate isolation of Kurika behind. He believed he might be forced into a uniform and sent to the trenches of the Eastern Front. But history intervened in a strange way. During the medical evaluation in early 1917, the military doctors examined his left arm, the arm that had been permanently damaged and shortened by the horse-drawn carriage accident in Gori so many years ago. The doctors concluded that the arm was too stiff, weak, and deformed for standard military service. Stalin was declared physically unfit for the army. He was not sent to the front, but he was not allowed to return home either. He was ordered to serve out the remaining months of his exile in a slightly less remote town closer to the railway line. He settled in Achinsk, waiting impatiently as the winter of 1917 began to fade. He did not have to wait long. In late February 1917, the pressure cooker of the Russian Empire finally exploded. Food riots in the capital city of Petrograd quickly transformed into a massive, unstoppable revolution. Soldiers refused to fire on the crowds and joined the workers instead. The absolute power of the Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for over 300 years, collapsed in a matter of days. The Tsar abdicated the throne, and a weak, temporary provisional government took control of the country. The news reached the remote town of Achinsk like a thunderbolt. The old world was dead. The prison gates were thrown open, the exile system was abolished, and all political prisoners were declared free citizens. Stalin did not waste a single moment celebrating or drinking with the ecstatic crowds in the streets. He immediately packed his meager belongings, walked to the local train station, and boarded the first crowded, chaotic train heading west toward Petrograd. As the train rattled across the vast expanse of Siberia, moving past the endless forests that had held him prisoner for 5 long years, the 38-year-old revolutionary stared out the window with an icy, focused intensity. He was no longer the young, impulsive Georgian organizer who had been caught by the police in Batumi. He was Stalin, a man forged by the brutal violence of his childhood, disciplined by the surveillance of the Seminary, and hardened into cold steel by the absolute isolation of the Arctic wilderness. The empire that had chained him was gone, and the keys to a new world were waiting in the chaotic streets of the capital. The train carrying Stalin from the depths of his Siberian exile finally rattled into the Finland station in Petrograd in March 1917. The city was unrecognizable. The old imperial capital, once defined by the rigid hierarchy of Tsarist officials and the grand parades of the Imperial Guard, was now a swirling, chaotic vortex of revolutionary energy. Red flags drooped from the balconies of stone palaces. Street corners were crowded with workers and soldiers arguing over politics until their voices grew hoarse, and the air was thick with the scent of cheap tobacco and absolute uncertainty. The Tsar was gone, replaced by a fragile, uneasy double government. The elite provisional government, which wanted to keep fighting World War I, and the Petrograd Soviet, a massive council of workers and soldiers who wanted immediate peace and bread. Stalin stepped off the train with no money and a single battered suitcase, but he possessed something far more valuable: seniority within the Bolshevik Party. While Vladimir Lenin and other senior leaders were still stuck in comfortable exile in Switzerland, scrambling to find a way back to Russia, Stalin was one of the very first high-ranking Bolsheviks to arrive in the capital. He did not waste time joining the ecstatic crowds celebrating in the streets. He walked directly to the party's headquarters, his quiet, deliberate steps contrasting sharply with the frantic energy around him. Alongside Lev Kamenev, another veteran revolutionary who had returned on the same train, Stalin immediately took control of Pravda Truth, the official Bolshevik party newspaper. The press was the most powerful weapon the party had in the spring of 1917, and Stalin knew how to use it. At first, his political line was cautious and moderate. He argued that the Bolsheviks should support the provisional government as long as it fought against the remnants of the old Tsarist system, and he suggested that Russia might need to continue defending itself against the invading German army. But in April 1917, everything changed. Vladimir Lenin arrived in Petrograd inside a sealed German train, bursting into the capital like a political hurricane. Lenin was furious with the moderate stance of the local Bolshevik leadership. He immediately issued his famous April Theses, demanding an absolute end to the imperialist war, no support whatsoever for the provisional government, and the immediate transfer of all power to the Soviets. Many veteran Bolsheviks were shocked by Lenin's radicalism, viewing his demands as completely unrealistic. Stalin, with his sharp, predatory instincts for power, watched the room closely. He quickly realized that Lenin held the absolute devotion of the party's rank-and-file members, the angry young factory workers and radicalized sailors who wanted immediate action. Without engaging in a public argument or defending his previous articles, Stalin silently shifted his position. He buried his earlier moderate views and fully aligned himself with Lenin's hardline strategy. He became Lenin's loyal, unyielding shadow in the committees, working tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure the leader's directives were executed without hesitation. Stalin's role during the tumultuous summer of 1917 was not that of a brilliant orator. While Leon Trotsky, who had recently joined the Bolsheviks, electrified massive crowds in the circuses and public squares with his soaring, poetic rhetoric. Stalin remained in the shadows. He did not possess Trotsky's theatrical brilliance or his charisma. Stalin's Georgian accent was heavy, his voice was relatively quiet, and his physical presence marked by his short stature, pockmarked face, and stiff left arm, did not command the attention of a stadium. Instead, Stalin ruled the backrooms. He was elected to the party's central committee, taking on the tedious, administrative tasks that the brilliant intellectuals found boring. He managed the party's printing presses, coordinated communication between secret regional cells, organized funding, and sat through endless, exhausting committee meetings. He was building an intimate, detailed knowledge of the party's human machinery. He learned exactly who could be trusted, who was weak, and who could be manipulated. In July 1917, the revolution hit a dangerous crisis. A massive, spontaneous uprising by radical soldiers and workers in Petrograd, known as the July Days, stalled out in confusion. The provisional government seized the opportunity to crush the Bolsheviks, labeling them as paid German spies. They arrested Trotsky and forced Lenin into hiding to avoid execution. During this perilous moment, it was Stalin who kept the party from collapsing. Because he was a low-profile bureaucrat who rarely spoke at public rallies, the secret police largely ignored him. He became the vital, dangerous link between the fugitive Lenin and the underground party. Stalin personally arranged for Lenin to shave his beard, put on a worker's wig, and flee across the border into the safety of Finland. While the brilliant stars of the revolution were either locked in prison cells or hiding in haystacks, the pockmarked man from Gori was single-handedly running the Bolshevik apparatus, keeping the newspapers printing and the communication lines open. By September, the provisional government was collapsing under the weight of military defeats and economic ruin. The conservative General Kornilov attempted a military coup to crush the revolution, forcing the desperate provisional government to arm the Bolshevik workers to defend the city. The coup failed, but the weapons remained in the hands of the Bolsheviks. The tide had turned completely. The Bolsheviks won majorities in the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets, and Lenin, writing frantic letters from his hiding place in Finland, demanded an immediate armed overthrow of the government. As the decisive night of October 24 approached, the Bolsheviks prepared their coup. Trotsky, as the head of the Petrograd Soviet's Military Revolutionary Committee, brilliantly organized the tactical movements of the Red Guards. They systematically seized the city's strategic points, the telegraph stations, the bridges over the Neva River, the power plants, and the state bank. Stalin's actions during the historic night of the October Revolution became a subject of intense historical rewriting in later decades, but the reality was quietly efficient. He did not lead a dramatic charge against the Winter Palace, nor did he command troops on the barricades. Instead, he spent the critical hours inside the Bolshevik headquarters at the Smolny Institute, a converted school for noble girls, running the communications center. He ensured that directives were sent to regional cities, coordinated the printing of revolutionary decrees, and stood by Lenin's side as an indispensable administrative assistant. He was the reliable enforcer who made sure the machinery of the coup didn't jam. When the dust settled and the provisional government was officially arrested, Lenin announced the formation of a new government, the Council of People's Commissars. Lenin took the top post, Trotsky became the Commissar for Foreign Affairs, and Stalin was rewarded for his quiet, relentless loyalty with the post of Commissar for Nationalities. It was a position that many within the party viewed as a secondary administrative role, but Stalin understood its immense strategic value. The former Russian Empire was an enormous, sprawling tapestry of different ethnic groups: Georgians, Ukrainians, Armenians, Uzbeks, and Poles, who made up more than half the population. Stalin, the provincial boy from the Caucasus who had been forced to wear a Russian placard around his neck at the Gori school, knew exactly how deep ethnic resentments ran. His job was to manage these diverse territories, keeping them aligned with the central Bolshevik government in Petrograd, as the country slid into a devastating, bloody civil war. Standing in the grand halls of the Smolny Institute, looking out at a city now under Bolshevik control, the 38-year-old Stalin knew the easy part was over. They had seized power in a single night, but keeping it would require a level of ruthlessness the world had never seen. The shadows of 1917 had provided him with a perfect cover to build his position. The great intellectuals of the party had spent the year basking in the applause of the masses, completely oblivious to the quiet man in the dark coat, who was systematically mastering the levers of the party machine. The euphoria of the October coup evaporated almost instantly, replaced by the grim reality of a country tearing itself apart. By the spring of 1918, the young Soviet Republic was surrounded on all sides by enemies. The White Armies, a loose coalition of former Tsarist generals, landlords, and foreign interventionists, launched a massive, coordinated assault to crush the Bolsheviks. Russia was plunged into a civil war of unimaginable savagery, a conflict defined not by grand battlefield maneuvers, but by mass executions, scorched earth tactics, and systemic starvation. To survive, the Bolsheviks unleashed the Red Terror. Vladimir Lenin and Felix Dzerzhinsky, the head of the newly formed secret police known as the Cheka, decreed that mercy was a counter-revolutionary luxury. The state explicitly authorized the execution of class enemies, the taking of hostages, and the brutal suppression of any internal dissent. Stalin, serving on the elite ruling council beside Lenin, welcomed this absolute ruthlessness. His violent childhood in Gori and his dark years below the Arctic Circle had prepared him perfectly for a war without rules. The critical crisis of 1918 was not just military, it was existential. The primary enemy was hunger. The rich grain-producing regions of Ukraine and Siberia had been cut off by the White Armies, leaving the industrial workers of Petrograd and the new capital, Moscow, on the brink of total starvation. The bread ration dropped to a few ounces a day, and starving workers began leaving the factories in droves. Lenin knew that if the capital starved, the revolution would collapse from within. In June 1918, Lenin sent Stalin to the southern city of Tsaritsyn on the Volga River. Tsaritsyn was a strategic gateway. It controlled the vital shipping routes that brought grain and oil from the Caucasus north to Moscow. Stalin was given absolute, dictatorial powers to secure food supplies. His instructions were brief: seize the grain by any means necessary and ship it north. When Stalin arrived in Tsaritsyn by armored train, accompanied by a personal detachment of Red Guards, he found a city in absolute chaos. The local military command was incompetent, the train lines were bottlenecked by corruption, and white cavalry units led by General Pyotr Krasnov were actively advancing on the city's outskirts. Stalin did not hesitate. He bypassed the traditional civilian authorities and set up a military command council inside his armored train carriage. He viewed the food crisis not as a logistical problem, but as a military conspiracy. He assumed that if grain was not moving, it was because counter-revolutionaries, hidden Tsarist officers, and wealthy peasants, the kulaks, were actively sabotaging the shipments. He unleashed his own localized version of the Red Terror. He took direct control of the local Cheka, turning it into a personal instrument of absolute authority. On his direct orders, hundreds of local merchants, former imperial engineers, and suspected middle-class citizens were arrested and thrown into the dark holds of large wooden barges anchored on the Volga River. These barges became floating concentration camps. Late at night, under the cover of darkness, Cheka firing squads systematically executed dozens of prisoners, dumping their bodies directly into the muddy waters of the river. When a local Bolshevik official questioned the lack of formal trials, Stalin looked at him coldly and replied that the revolution could not be delayed by paperwork. It was during the defense of Tsaritsyn that the intense, lifelong rivalry between Stalin and Leon Trotsky transformed into a bitter, venomous hatred. Trotsky had been appointed supreme commander of the Red Army. To win the war, Trotsky realized that the raw, undisciplined Red Guard detachments were no match for the professional White armies. He made a controversial decision to recruit thousands of former Tsarist military officers, known as military specialists, to lead the Red Army units, placing political commissars beside them to ensure their loyalty. Stalin, operating out of his southern stronghold, deeply despised this policy. He possessed a profound, paranoid hatred for the old imperial elite and refused to take orders from the aristocratic Trotsky. Stalin systematically undermined Trotsky's military specialists in Tsaritsyn. He arrested the imperial officers Trotsky sent down, threw them into the Volga barges, and replaced them with tough, uneducated but absolutely loyal Red commanders who shared his coarse background. Among these men was Clement Voroshilov, a former factory worker turned guerrilla fighter who became Stalin's lifelong military puppet. Trotsky was furious. From his own high-speed armored train moving across the fronts, he sent frantic, angry telegrams to Lenin in Moscow, demanding that Stalin be reined in. Trotsky argued that Stalin's insubordination and amateur military tactics were sabotaging the wider war effort. He threatened to court-martial Stalin's favorites if they did not follow the Central Command's orders. The conflict between the two men was deeply personal and cultural. Trotsky was a brilliant, elegant intellectual who wrote soaring prose, spoke fluent French and German, and carried himself with the dramatic flair of a historical conqueror. Stalin was a coarse, pockmarked organizer who dressed in a simple, unadorned military tunic, smoked a cheap pipe filled with rough tobacco, and spoke in short, blunt sentences. To Stalin, Trotsky was an arrogant, preening intellectual who thought he was better than everyone else. To Trotsky, Stalin was a narrow-minded, provincial mediocrity who was useful only for dark, backstage thuggery. Despite the internal feuding, Stalin's brutal methods yielded immediate results that pleased Lenin. He successfully cleared the train lines, broke the strikes in the local factories through mass arrests, and sent trainload after trainload of seized southern grain rumbling north to the starving workers of Moscow. Lenin, desperate for food supplies, overlooked Stalin's insubordination. When the White armies launched a furious assault to capture Tsaritsyn, Stalin, Voroshilov, and their crude army fought with a stubborn, desperate ferocity, successfully throwing the White cavalry back into the steppe. The city remained in Bolshevik hands. Stalin returned to Moscow in late 1918 as a triumphant warlord. He had proven that his willingness to shed blood without hesitation could stabilize a failing front. Lenin recognized this quality and continued to deploy Stalin as a political troubleshooter throughout the remainder of the Civil War. Whenever a front was collapsing, whenever a city was threatened by betrayal, or whenever the local party apparatus was fracturing under pressure, Lenin sent the man of steel. Stalin traveled to the Baltic front to defend Petrograd against a British-backed White advance, executing suspected naval officers without a second thought. He was sent to the Southern Front during the disastrous war with Poland in 1920, where his stubborn refusal to coordinate his armies with Trotsky's strategy contributed to a massive Soviet defeat outside Warsaw, an event that only deepened the bitter animosity between the two men. By the time the Civil War drew to a close in 1921, the Bolsheviks had won, but the country was a smoking, ruined graveyard. The old Russian Empire had lost millions of lives to combat, typhus, and devastating famines. The economy was completely shattered, and the population was traumatized by years of unremitting state violence. The war had also fundamentally transformed the Bolshevik Party itself. The idealistic debates of 1917 were dead. The party had become a highly centralized, militarized machine that ruled by decree, secret police terror, and absolute obedience. Stalin had found his true home in this new, hardened environment. The methods he practiced on the blood-soaked banks of the Volga at Tsaritsyn, where the city would later be renamed Stalingrad in his honor, were no longer a temporary wartime exception. They had become the foundational blueprint for how he intended to govern the entire empire. By 1922, the smoke of the Russian Civil War had finally cleared, leaving behind a scarred, exhausted nation. The Bolsheviks had won the military battle, but the country they now ruled was a vast graveyard of ruined factories, collapsed bridges, and starving villages. To survive, Vladimir Lenin had to temporarily pull back from pure communism. He introduced the new economic policy, which allowed small-scale private trade and let peasants sell their extra grain for profit. The radical heroics of the battlefield were over. The era of administrative rebuilding had begun. It was in this gray, unexciting new era that Stalin found his ultimate pathway to absolute power. The brilliant intellectuals of the party, men like Leon Trotsky, Nikolai Bukharin, and Grigory Zinoviev, were busy writing long theoretical articles, arguing in public forums, and giving dramatic speeches about the global proletarian revolution. They viewed the day-to-day administrative paperwork of running a country as boring, low-level clerk work beneath their dignity. Stalin did not share their arrogance. He understood a fundamental truth that escaped them all. In a one-party state, the man who controls the paperwork controls the empire. In April 1922, at the 11th Party Congress, a new administrative post was created to manage the rapidly expanding state apparatus, General Secretary of the Central Committee. The position was not intended to be a political leadership role. It was designed to be a heavy, tedious administrative job, managing personnel files, assigning party members to regional posts, answering correspondence, and keeping track of membership cards. Lenin looked for a reliable, hard-working enforcer to take on this mountain of bureaucratic labor. He chose Stalin. The other party leaders dismissed the appointment as minor. Trotsky, in particular, looked down his nose at Stalin's new title, viewing him as little more than a glorified filing clerk. They completely failed to see the trap Stalin was quietly constructing beneath their feet. Stalin moved into a modest office in the party headquarters on Staraya Square in Moscow. While the other leaders traveled abroad or rested at luxury dachas, Stalin spent 14 hours a day behind his desk, surrounded by thousands of index cards and personal files. The Bolshevik Party was growing rapidly, expanding from a small underground conspiracy into a massive governing machine of hundreds of thousands of members. Every time a town needed a new party boss, every time a factory required a new director, and every time a province needed a new Cheka chief, the paperwork crossed Stalin's desk. Systematically, patiently, and without drawing attention to himself, Stalin began filling these empty posts with his own people. He looked for a specific type of man to promote: young, coarse, uneducated regional workers who had fought in the Civil War. These men did not care about complex Marxist philosophy or global revolution. They cared about job security, authority, and status. They were deeply intimidated by brilliant intellectuals like Trotsky, but they felt comfortable with Stalin, who spoke bluntly and shared their rough background. By promoting thousands of these provincial loyalists to key local positions, Stalin was quietly building an immovable, invisible army of supporters who owed their entire careers to him. Within a few months, Stalin had created a massive patron-client network. If a regional party secretary wanted to keep his apartment, his state car, and his authority, he had to remain loyal to the general secretary. If he crossed Stalin, his name would quietly disappear from the promotion list, and he would find himself assigned to a miserable, freezing post in northern Siberia. Stalin also took control of the Party Control Commission, the internal organ responsible for investigating and expelling corrupt or disobedient party members. He had built a double-edged sword. He could reward absolute loyalty with rapid promotion, and he could punish the slightest defiance with administrative destruction. In May 1922, a sudden political earthquake shattered the stability of the Kremlin. Lenin suffered a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed and temporarily unable to speak. The undisputed master of the revolution was suddenly fragile and mortal. A quiet, desperate panic gripped the inner circle, and the unspoken race to succeed him began in earnest. As Lenin's health deteriorated through the rest of the year, Stalin utilized his bureaucratic position to isolate the dying leader. Under the guise of protecting Lenin's health, the Central Committee appointed Stalin as the official guardian of Lenin's medical regime. Stalin determined who could visit the leader, what newspapers he was allowed to read, and which doctors were permitted to see him. Stalin effectively placed the founder of the Soviet state under a polite form of house arrest at his estate in Gorky. However, Lenin was not entirely blind to what was happening. During his brief periods of recovery, he watched with growing horror as the bureaucratic monster he had helped create began to twist the party out of shape. He saw how rude, aggressive, and excessively powerful Stalin had become. The tension broke into open conflict in December 1922, when Stalin discovered that Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, had helped Lenin dictate a private letter to Trotsky. Furious at this breach of his information quarantine, Stalin telephoned Krupskaya and subjected her to a vicious, insulting tirade, calling her a state-disruptive element and threatening to bring her before the Party Control Commission. When Lenin learned of this insult to his wife, his anger was absolute. In late December 1922 and early January 1923, he dictated a secret document to his stenographers that would become known to history as his testament. It was a raw, brutally honest evaluation of the top Bolshevik leaders. While he criticized Trotsky for excessive self-confidence, his most severe and devastating words were reserved for the General Secretary. Lenin wrote, "Comrade Stalin, having become General Secretary, has concentrated boundless authority in his hands, and I am not sure whether he will always be capable of using that authority with sufficient caution." A few days later, Lenin added an even more explosive postscript. "Stalin is too coarse, and this defect, although quite tolerable in our midst and in dealings among us communists, becomes intolerable in a general secretary. That is why I suggest the comrades think of a way of removing Stalin from that post and appointing another man in his place." This document was a political death sentence for Stalin. If it was read aloud to the Party Congress, Stalin's career would be completely destroyed overnight. The stenographers locked the dictated pages away in a safe, waiting for the right moment to present them to the central leadership. Stalin knew that Lenin was preparing a blow against him, and he spent the early months of 1923 in a state of intense, masked anxiety, waiting to see if his bureaucratic fortress would hold against the immense prestige of the dying leader. But fortune favored the man of steel. In March 1923, before he could launch his political attack against Stalin at the upcoming party congress, Lenin suffered a third, catastrophic stroke. This time, the damage was permanent. The stroke completely destroyed his power of speech and left him bedridden, a silent prisoner inside his own body. The only man who possessed the unquestioned authority to strip Stalin of his power was silenced forever. Stalin breathed a quiet sigh of relief. The danger had not passed entirely. The testament still existed in the dark shadows of the Kremlin safes, but the immediate threat was gone. With Lenin permanently incapacitated, the brilliant stars of the revolution began to circle each other like wolves, completely oblivious to the fact that the quiet bureaucrat sitting in the corner office had already systematically rewired the entire machine of the state, ensuring that, when the final struggle for the succession began, the votes would already belong to him. On January 21, 1924, the heavy silence at the Gorky estate was broken by a final, fatal gasp. Vladimir Lenin was dead. The news hit Moscow like a physical blow, plunging the nation into deep mourning and throwing the Communist Party into an immediate, unspoken panic. The ideological anchor of the revolution was gone. The man who had held the volatile factions together through sheer force of will had vanished, leaving a vast vacuum at the top of the Soviet state. Stalin, utilizing his absolute control over the party administration, immediately took charge of the funeral arrangements. He understood that in a revolutionary state, the man who controls the funeral controls the legacy. He transformed himself overnight from a dry, backroom bureaucrat into the high priest of a new, secular religion. He ignored the explicit, modest wishes of Lenin's widow, Nadezhda Krupskaya, who begged for a simple burial. Instead, Stalin ordered Lenin's body to be expertly embalmed and placed inside a temporary wooden mausoleum in Red Square, turning the dead leader into an immortal, holy relic. At the grand funeral, Stalin staged a masterful political theater. He stood prominently by the coffin, leading the grieving nation in a dramatic, quasi-religious oath of absolute loyalty to Lenin's memory. While Stalin occupied the center of the frame, his chief rival, Leon Trotsky, was conspicuously absent. Trotsky, who was traveling south to the Caucasus to recover from a persistent illness, had missed the funeral entirely. Stalin had deliberately sent Trotsky a telegram containing the wrong date for the burial, calculatedly ensuring that the supreme commander would appear cold, distant, and disrespectful to the masses. It was the first structural blow in a long, vicious campaign of political assassination. With Lenin in the tomb, the real war began. The stakes were absolute. Whoever won would control a sixth of the world's surface. On paper, Trotsky remained the most formidable candidate. He was the legendary organizer of the October Revolution, the creator of the victorious Red Army, a brilliant intellectual and a mesmerizing orator who still held the devotion of thousands of young students, soldiers, and radical workers. Stalin knew he could not defeat Trotsky in a direct, open conflict. He needed allies. He formed a secret, powerful political alliance known as the Triumvirate, the Troika, with two other prominent Bolshevik leaders, Grigory Zinoviev, the powerful boss of the Petrograd Party organization, and Lev Kamenev, the influential leader of the Moscow party machine. Both Zinoviev and Kamenev were vain, ambitious intellectuals who possessed an intense, paranoid fear of Trotsky. They were terrified that Trotsky, with his control over the military, would transform himself into a communist Napoleon and establish a military dictatorship. Stalin carefully played into their fears. He acted humble, presenting himself to them as a simple, reliable administrator who had no personal ambitions for supreme power. He convinced Zinoviev and Kamenev that he was merely a useful tool they could use to crush Trotsky, after which they could divide the empire between themselves. They fell completely into the trap. The first massive crisis for Stalin arrived in May 1924, just before the 13th Party Congress. Krupskaya formally handed Lenin's secret testament to the Central Committee. The document, which explicitly called for Stalin's removal as General Secretary due to his coarseness and boundless authority, was read aloud to a closed meeting of the top party leaders. The room fell into a tense, suffocating silence. Stalin sat in the corner, his face pale, staring down at his hands, waiting for the axe to fall. It was Zinoviev who saved him. Convinced that Stalin was harmless and essential for their fight against Trotsky, Zinoviev stood up and addressed the meeting. He argued that Lenin's fears had proven groundless, that Stalin had shown himself capable of working harmoniously with the party, and that publishing the document would only create dangerous divisions that their capitalist enemies would exploit. Kamenev immediately backed Zinoviev's statement. Trotsky, sitting across the room, remained silent, refusing to engage in what he viewed as a low, unprincipled squabble over administrative posts. The committee voted to keep the testament permanently secret, locking it away from the public. Stalin had survived the most dangerous moment of his life. Saved by his allies, Stalin immediately turned the full power of his bureaucratic machine against Trotsky. He did not engage in complex debates about Marxist theory. Instead, he utilized the personnel department to systematically isolate Trotsky's supporters. If a prominent general or party official expressed support for Trotsky, Stalin's office quietly transferred them to a remote post in Vladivostok or Central Asia, replacing them with a loyalist from the General Secretary's files. Simultaneously, Stalin unleashed a devastating ideological campaign. He introduced a new, comforting political doctrine called socialism in one country. He argued that the Soviet Union could successfully build a complete communist society on its own, utilizing its own immense resources, without waiting for the uncertain prospects of a global proletarian revolution. This stood in sharp contrast to Trotsky's older theory of permanent revolution, which insisted that Soviet socialism could only survive if workers in advanced Western European countries overthrew their own capitalists. Stalin's theory was simple, patriotic, and deeply appealing to an exhausted nation. The Russian people were tired of years of war, famine, and global instability. They wanted to believe that their immense sacrifices had a purpose, and that they could build their own paradise without depending on foreign workers. Stalin framed Trotsky as a pessimistic, arrogant intellectual who lacked faith in the creative power of the Russian proletariat. Through 1924 and 1925, the Triumvirate systematically dismantled Trotsky's reputation. The state-controlled press, completely managed by Stalin's appointees, began printing endless articles attacking Trotskyism. They dragged up old arguments Trotsky had had with Lenin before 1917, entirely rewriting history to paint Trotsky as a latecomer to the party who had always been ideologically untrustworthy. Trotsky, suffering from bouts of depression and chronic fever, withdrew further into isolation. He refused to fight back using his popularity within the army, fearing that a military intervention would destroy the party. In January 1925, under intense pressure from the Triumvirate, Trotsky was forced to resign from his post as Supreme Commander of the Red Army, losing his most powerful institutional lever. With Trotsky effectively broken and isolated, the Triumvirate had outlived its usefulness. Stalin no longer needed Zinoviev and Kamenev, and he prepared to destroy them next. He silently dissolved the alliance and formed a new, secret pact with the right wing of the party, led by Nikolai Bukharin, the brilliant editor of Pravda, and Alexei Rykov, the head of the state government. Bukharin favored a moderate economic policy, wanting to continue the new economic policy and allow the peasantry to prosper gradually. Stalin enthusiastically backed Bukharin, using his moderate views to counter the radical, leftist economic demands of his former partners. Too late, Zinoviev and Kamenev realized the terrifying nature of the monster they had helped feed. They watched in horror as the General Secretary's regional appointees systematically voted down their proposals at every committee meeting. In late 1925, finding themselves completely outvoted and marginalized within their own strongholds, Zinoviev and Kamenev attempted to mount a desperate opposition. They tried to sound the alarm about Stalin's growing personal dictatorship, but the party machine they had helped build to crush Trotsky was now turned against them. Their speeches were drowned out by the organized booing and jeering of Stalin's loyalists, and the newspapers refused to print their articles. In a state of utter desperation, Zinoviev and Kamenev swallowed their immense pride and approached Trotsky in 1926, forming a frantic coalition known as the United Opposition. It was a tragic, pathetic alliance of defeated giants. They held secret meetings in the forests outside Moscow, printed illegal leaflets, and attempted to appeal directly to the factory workers. But Stalin was entirely unconcerned. He controlled the police, the press, and the voting blocs. Every move the opposition made was instantly reported to Stalin by Cheka informants. Stalin systematically branded the United Opposition as illegal factionalists who were actively violating Lenin's sacred rule against dividing the party. The end came swiftly. In the autumn of 1927, during the 10th anniversary celebrations of the October Revolution, the opposition attempted to lead a small public demonstration in the streets of Moscow and Leningrad. Stalin's police forces and organized gangs of thugs easily broke up the rallies, arresting the participants. Within weeks, the Central Committee officially expelled Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev from the Communist Party. Zinoviev and Kamenev, completely broken by the loss of their party status, collapsed into humiliating surrender. They signed groveling letters of apology, begging Stalin for forgiveness, and admitting their theoretical errors just to be readmitted as low-level functionaries. Stalin accepted their submission, keeping them around as humiliated examples of his absolute power. Trotsky refused to surrender. In January 1928, on Stalin's direct orders, secret police agents entered Trotsky's apartment, picked up the legendary creator of the Red Army, and packed him onto a train bound for internal exile in the remote city of Alma-Ata near the Chinese border. A year later, Stalin would banish him from the Soviet Union entirely, sending him into permanent wandering exile abroad. Standing alone at the center of power, the 49-year-old Stalin looked around the Kremlin. The brilliant stars of 1917, the charismatic orators, the celebrated theorists, the close companions of Lenin, had all been systematically outmaneuvered, isolated, and destroyed by a man they had contemptuously dismissed as a filing clerk. The Triumvirate's trap had snapped shut, but it was Stalin who held the keys to the cage. He was no longer just the General Secretary managing files. He was the undisputed, absolute master of the Soviet Empire, ready to unleash a new, terrifying revolution from above that would reshape human history in blood and iron. By 1928, the political landscape of the Soviet Union belonged entirely to Stalin. The brilliant intellectuals who had led the revolution were gone, exiled, silenced, or broken. But as Stalin looked out from his office in the Kremlin, he faced a problem far bigger than any political rival. The Soviet Union was trapped in a dangerous time warp. While the capitalist nations of the West were building massive car factories, steel mills, and advanced electrical grids, the Soviet Union remained a backward, agrarian country. Millions of wooden plows still turned the soil, and the entire economy depended on the whims of millions of independent peasants. The immediate crisis was grain. The peasants, whom the party divided into poor laborers and wealthier farmers called kulaks, were refusing to sell their grain to the state. The state offered artificially low prices for wheat and rye while charging high prices for basic manufactured goods like boots and shirts. The peasants did the logical thing. They hid their grain, fed it to their livestock, or waited for prices to rise. In the winter of 1928, the food supplies in the major cities plummeted. Bread lines formed once again in Moscow and Leningrad. The industrial workers, the very foundation of the Bolshevik state, were facing starvation. Stalin's former allies on the right wing of the party, led by Nikolai Bukharin, argued for patience. They wanted to raise grain prices, incentivize the peasants, and industrialize the country slowly over decades. Stalin had no patience left. He looked at the maps of Europe and saw a continent preparing for a future war. He believed the Soviet Union had less than a decade to industrialize or be crushed by its capitalist neighbors. He dumped Bukharin and the right wing into the political graveyard and announced a radical, terrifying solution: the first five-year plan. The plan demanded the immediate, forced modernization of the entire country. Stalin intended to build massive steel cities in the wilderness, giant hydroelectric dams on the rivers, and vast tractor factories in the provinces. To pay for the heavy machinery needed from abroad, the state required an absolute, guaranteed supply of cheap grain to export for gold. Stalin's solution was forced collectivization. The millions of small, private peasant farms would be abolished overnight. They would be violently merged into giant, state-controlled collective farms called kolkhozes. On these farms, the state would own the land, the horses, and the tractors. The state would dictate exactly what to plant, and the state would take the harvest first. The primary obstacle to this plan was the peasantry itself. For centuries, the Russian peasant's ultimate dream was to own his own piece of land. They had supported the Bolsheviks in 1917 precisely because Lenin promised them the land. Now, Stalin was taking it back. To break their resistance, Stalin declared an all-out ideological war against the wealthier farmers. In late 1929, he announced a new policy: the liquidation of the kulaks as a class. The term kulak was deliberately vague. In reality, a kulak was often just a hard-working peasant who owned 2 cows, a slightly larger barn, or could afford to hire a neighbor during the harvest. But Stalin transformed the kulak into a demonic figure, a capitalist saboteur who was deliberately trying to starve the workers of the revolution. In the winter of 1930, Stalin unleashed the full power of the state against the countryside. He sent brigades of fanatical young communist workers from the cities, backed by heavily armed units of the Ogpu, the successor to the Cheka secret police, into the villages. These brigades were known as the 25,000ers. They arrived in the snowy villages with absolute authority to arrest, search, and confiscate. The process of dekulakization was brutal and swift. The brigades entered a village, gathered the poor peasants, and demanded they point out the kulaks. The chosen families were stripped of everything. The activists took their land, their homes, their grain reserves, their warm winter coats, and even the shoes off their children's feet. Anyone who protested was branded a counter-revolutionary and shot on the spot. For millions of others, the punishment was deportation. Whole families, old men, pregnant women, and infants, were packed into unheated cattle cars in the dead of winter. They were shipped thousands of miles away to the frozen wastes of Siberia or the barren deserts of Central Asia. The conditions on these prison trains were horrific. Thousands died of typhus, starvation, and exposure before ever reaching their destinations. When the survivors were dumped in the middle of the empty Siberian taiga without tools, shelter, or food, thousands more perished in the snow. Over the course of the campaign, nearly 2 million peasants were deported, their lives completely shattered to clear the path for the collective farms. The remaining peasantry did not surrender quietly. A wave of desperate, violent resistance swept across the rural areas of the empire. Peasants formed guerrilla bands, attacking the collective farm buildings and assassinating the communist activists sent from the cities. When the state forces arrived with machine guns to suppress the riots, the peasants turned to a desperate form of economic sabotage. Rather than surrender their beloved livestock to the collective farms, they chose to slaughter them. Across the country, millions of peasants killed their own horses, cows, pigs, and sheep. The fields became open slaughterhouses. The scale of the destruction was catastrophic. Within a few short years, the Soviet Union lost more than half of its total livestock population. This loss had a devastating knock-on effect. Without horses to pull the plows and without manure to fertilize the soil, agricultural production collapsed completely. Stalin watched the chaos from the Kremlin with an icy, unyielding determination. When local officials sent frantic letters warning that agriculture was spinning out of control, Stalin accused them of weakness and falling under the influence of class enemies. He demanded absolute compliance. The grain quotas imposed on the new collective farms were set at impossibly high levels. Even when a collective farm experienced a terrible harvest due to the chaos and weather, the state refused to lower its demands. By 1932, the inevitable result arrived: a massive man-made famine of apocalyptic proportions. The crisis hit the richest grain-producing regions the hardest: southern Russia, the Volga region, Kazakhstan, and especially Ukraine, the traditional breadbasket of Europe. In Ukraine, the famine was not an accident of nature. It was a state-engineered catastrophe that would become known as the Holodomor. Stalin viewed the Ukrainian peasantry with a double layer of suspicion. He saw them not just as stubborn farmers resisting communism, but as potential Ukrainian nationalists who threatened the unity of the Soviet Empire. He decided to break them permanently. In the autumn of 1932, Stalin signed a series of draconian decrees. He sent top enforcers, including Vyacheslav Molotov and Lazar Kaganovich, to Ukraine to oversee the absolute extraction of grain. The state introduced the notorious Law of 5 ears of corn. Under this law, any peasant caught picking a few leftover stalks of grain from a collective field to feed his starving children was guilty of stealing socialist property. The punishment was immediate execution or 10 years in a labor camp. The Ogpu and activist brigades systematically sealed off the Ukrainian border, preventing starving peasants from fleeing to the cities or neighboring provinces in search of bread. They went house to house in the villages, using long iron rods to probe the earth, searching for hidden jars of grain. They confiscated everything edible: potatoes, beets, dried vegetables, and farm animals. If a village failed to meet its impossible grain quota, the state placed it on a blacklist. This meant all trade stopped, all food supplies were cut off, and the village was left to die in total isolation. By the winter of 1933, the countryside became a living landscape of horror. The streets of Ukrainian villages were littered with the swollen bodies of the dead, which lay unburied for weeks, because the survivors were too weak to dig into the frozen earth. People ate grass, tree bark, leather boots, and domestic dogs and cats. In the absolute extremes of hunger, instances of cannibalism became a terrifying reality, with the secret police registering hundreds of cases across the region. While millions were dying in the villages, Stalin's government continued to export millions of tons of grain abroad to buy industrial machinery for the steel mills of Magnitogorsk and the tractor factories of Kharkiv. The official state newspapers never mentioned the famine. The word itself was strictly forbidden in public discourse. Foreign journalists who tried to report on the disaster were expelled or pressured into silence by the sophisticated Soviet propaganda machine. The human cost of breaking the peasantry was staggering. Between 1932 and 1933, an estimated 5 to 7 million people starved to death across the Soviet Union, with nearly 4 million of those casualties occurring in Ukraine alone. By late 1933, the famine finally began to recede, leaving behind a completely subjugated, terrorized countryside. The resistance was broken. The independent Russian and Ukrainian peasant who had existed for generations was gone forever. The survivors were now bound to the collective farms, working under the watchful eyes of state directors, dependent on the Kremlin for their very survival. Stalin had won his war against the countryside. He had secured the cheap grain he needed to fund his rapid industrialization, and he had proven to the entire nation that no human cost, no matter how many millions of lives it took, would ever make the man of steel flinch from his path. By 1934, the Soviet Union had been completely transformed. The countryside was broken and collective farms covered the map. In the cities, huge factories were roaring, and new industrial cities had risen from the earth. Stalin had defeated every political rival and crushed the independent peasantry. To the outside world, he was the absolute ruler of a united nation. But inside the thick stone walls of the Kremlin, Stalin did not feel safe. He felt surrounded by hidden enemies. His paranoia was not entirely imaginary. The horrific suffering of the forced industrialization and the millions of deaths during the Great Famine had created deep, silent anger within the Communist Party itself. Many regional officials and old revolutionaries were quietly horrified by Stalin's methods. They began to wonder if the man of steel had gone too far. The first clear sign of this internal discontent appeared in February 1917 retrospective historical analysis of the 17th Party Congress, known as the Congress of Victors. During the secret ballot elections for the new Central Committee, several hundred delegates crossed out Stalin's name. At the same time, Sergei Kirov, the young, highly popular and charismatic boss of the Leningrad Party organization, received a massive ovation from the delegates. Kirov represented a more moderate path. He favored reconciliation with the peasantry and a softening of the state's harsh methods. Many whispered that Kirov would make a much better general secretary than the coarse, paranoid Stalin. Stalin watched Kirov's growing popularity with an icy, silent rage. He understood the message perfectly. As long as an alternative leader existed within the party, his own position was not completely secure. The spark that ignited the explosion occurred on December 1, 1934. Sergei Kirov was walking down the corridor of his headquarters at the Smolny Institute in Leningrad. A young, disgruntled man named Leonid Nikolaev slipped out of a bathroom, stepped up behind Kirov, and shot him dead with a pistol. The assassination shocked the country. Stalin immediately boarded a special train to Leningrad to personally lead the investigation. The historical truth behind the murder remains shrouded in mystery, but one thing is absolutely certain. Stalin seized upon Kirov's death as the perfect political weapon. He immediately claimed that Nikolaev was not a lone gunman, but an operative working for a massive, underground counter-revolutionary conspiracy. Stalin argued that this hidden terrorist network was directed by his old enemies, Leon Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, and Lev Kamenev, and was actively plotting to assassinate the entire Soviet leadership to restore capitalism. On the very night of Kirov's murder, Stalin signed a draconian new law that stripped anyone accused of terrorist acts of all basic rights. There would be no defense lawyers, no right to appeal, and the death penalty would be carried out immediately within hours of the verdict. The machinery of the Great Terror was assembled and ready. Stalin placed Nikolai Yezhov, a fanatical, dwarf-sized bureaucrat who was absolutely loyal to him, in charge of the secret police, now called the NKVD. Yezhov was nicknamed the Iron Hedgehog. Under Stalin's direct guidance, Yezhov transformed the NKVD into a giant, industrial machine of mass arrest and murder. The first major phase of the terror unfolded on the stage of the Grand October Hall in Moscow. Stalin organized a series of meticulously scripted public events known as the Moscow Show Trials. In August 1936, the first trial began. The main defendants were his old rivals, Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, the very men who had helped him crush Trotsky a decade earlier. The world watched in utter disbelief as these veteran revolutionaries, men who had spent their entire lives fighting the Tsar, stood before the Soviet court and brokenly confessed to the most absurd, monstrous crimes. They admitted to poisoning wells, sabotaging factories, collaborating with Nazi Germany, and organizing the murder of Kirov. The secret to these bizarre confessions lay in the dark basements of the Lubyanka, the notorious NKVD headquarters. Before the trials, the defendants were subjected to weeks of psychological and physical torture. They were deprived of sleep for days, beaten systematically, and threatened with the absolute destruction and execution of their wives and young children if they did not cooperate. Stalin personally reviewed the scripts for the trials, sitting behind a dark screen in the balcony to watch his former comrades grovel before the state prosecutor, Andrei Vyshinsky. Vyshinsky ended his speeches by screaming, "Shoot these rabid dogs." They were taken to the basement that very night and shot in the back of the head. A second show trial followed in early 1937, and a third in 1938, which destroyed Nikolai Bukharin and the remaining leaders of the party's right wing. Stalin systematically wiped out the entire generation of old Bolsheviks, the men who had actually made the 1917 revolution alongside Lenin. By the time he was finished, he was the only original leader left standing. But the terror did not stop with the top leadership. In the summer of 1937, Stalin turned his paranoid gaze toward the ultimate shield of the Soviet state, the Red Army. He convinced himself that the military high command, led by the brilliant, aristocratic Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, was plotting a military coup against the Kremlin in alliance with the German army. In June 1937, Tukhachevsky and the top generals of the Red Army were suddenly arrested. They were tortured so brutally that Tukhachevsky's official written confession was found stained with drops of his own blood. Following a brief, secret military tribunal, they were executed. Stalin then ordered an absolute, devastating purge of the entire military officer corps. The NKVD systematically arrested, imprisoned, or shot over 35,000 military officers. They wiped out 3 out of 5 marshals, 13 out of 15 army commanders, and the vast majority of the divisional commanders. Stalin had effectively decapitated his own army, stripping it of its most experienced, modern, and highly educated leaders, just as the threat of a major European war with Nazi Germany was growing on the horizon. By late 1937, the Great Purge exploded into an uncontrollable whirlwind that engulfed the entire Soviet society. Stalin and Yezhov signed NKVD Order No. 00447, which targeted anti-Soviet elements. The order established strict numerical quotas for every province and republic in the Soviet Union. Each region was told exactly how many people it had to arrest and execute, Category 1, and how many it had to send to the labor camps, Category 2. Local NKVD bosses, terrified of appearing soft or counter-revolutionary themselves, routinely wrote letters back to Moscow begging Stalin to increase their quotas. Stalin routinely scribbled "approved" or "increased by several thousand" on the margins of these horrific lists. The atmosphere in the country became toxic with absolute terror and suspicion. People vanished in the middle of the night, dragged out of their apartments by NKVD agents arriving in black cars known as Black Marias. Neighbors denounced neighbors to steal their apartments. Workers denounced their factory directors to take their jobs. Students denounced their professors to prove their communist zeal. No one was safe. A single joke about Stalin, an accidental typo in a local newspaper containing the leader's name, or a distant relative living abroad was enough to guarantee a death sentence. The vast majority of those arrested never even saw a real courtroom. Their fates were decided by the troikas, three-man NKVD committees that reviewed hundreds of cases a day, passing death sentences or 10-year terms in a matter of minutes without ever seeing the accused. For those who were not immediately shot, their destination was the Gulag, a vast, sprawling empire of forced labor camps managed by the NKVD that stretched across the most inhospitable regions of Siberia and the Arctic North. Millions of prisoners were forced to dig gold mines with their bare hands, chop lumber in sub-zero blizzards, and build giant canals through solid rock, living on starvation rations of watery soup and stale bread. Millions perished from exhaustion, disease, and cold, their bodies buried in unmarked mass graves in the frozen earth. By late 1938, Stalin realized that the terror was beginning to threaten the stability of the state itself. The economy was stalling because so many factory directors and engineers had been shot. The government administration was paralyzed by fear, and the army was in total disarray. With characteristic calculation, Stalin decided to shut down the machine and blame the excesses on the tools he had used to create it. He dismissed Nikolai Yezhov from his post as head of the NKVD, replacing him with a smooth, ruthless Georgian administrator named Lavrentiy Beria. Yezhov, the Iron Hedgehog, was quickly arrested, accused of being a British spy and sabotaging the state, and shot in the same basement where he had murdered thousands. The public was told that Yezhov had gone mad, and that the party was now correcting his mistakes. The Great Purge left the Soviet Union completely broken, silent, and absolutely submissive. An estimated 700,000 to 1 million people had been executed in less than 2 years, and millions more had been swallowed by the Gulag. The old Communist Party was dead. It had been replaced by a completely new organization made up of young, terrorized functionaries who knew nothing but absolute obedience to the master of the Kremlin. Stalin had achieved his ultimate goal. He had eradicated every possible source of dissent, creating a totalitarian state where his word was the only law, and where his absolute power was built upon an ocean of silence and blood. The absolute silence that followed the Great Purge left Stalin in total control of a terrorized nation. Every domestic enemy had been wiped out, and the new generation of officials knew only how to obey. But as Stalin looked beyond the borders of the Soviet Union in the late 1930s, the view was terrifying. The industrial success of his 5-year plans had built thousands of tanks and airplanes, but the purge of the Red Army had left the military without its best minds. Across the border to the west, a new and aggressive monster had grown to full strength: Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. Stalin understood fascism perfectly. He knew that Hitler's hatred for communism was absolute, and he had read Mein Kampf, where the German dictator openly stated his dream of conquering the vast lands of Russia and Ukraine to create living space for the German master race. For years, Soviet foreign policy had tried to build a system of collective security with the Western democracies, Britain and France, to contain the Nazi threat. Stalin had ordered communist parties across Europe to join alliances with moderate politicians to block the fascists. But by 1938, Stalin's trust in the West collapsed completely. The turning point arrived with the Munich Agreement in September of that year. Britain and France, desperate to avoid another world war, chose to appease Hitler. They signed a treaty that allowed Germany to dismember Czechoslovakia, completely excluding the Soviet Union from the negotiations. Stalin watched this betrayal from the Kremlin with an icy, clinical detachment. He concluded that the Western leaders, especially the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, were untrustworthy and weak. He suspected that Britain and France were actively trying to steer Hitler's aggressive focus eastward, hoping that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union would engage in a giant, destructive war that would ruin both totalitarian systems, while the West sat safely on the sidelines. Stalin refused to play the role of the sacrificial lamb. If the Western democracies were going to play a cynical game of balance of power politics, he would show them that the man of steel could play it far better, and with absolutely no moral restraints. In May 1939, Stalin signaled a profound shift in his foreign policy. He dismissed his long-serving foreign minister, Maxim Litvinov, who was Jewish and a well-known supporter of collective security with the West. In his place, Stalin appointed his most reliable, cold-blooded bureaucrat, Vyacheslav Molotov. Molotov was a man of bureaucratic iron, completely devoid of personal feelings, who existed only to execute Stalin's directives. The removal of Litvinov and the arrival of Molotov sent a clear message to Berlin. The Soviet Union was ready to talk. Hitler, meanwhile, was preparing his own timeline. He had already absorbed Austria and Czechoslovakia, and his next target was Poland. But the German generals were terrified of a two-front war. They knew that if Germany invaded Poland, Britain and France would declare war in the West. Hitler could not afford to fight the massed armies of the Soviet Union in the East at the same exact time. Secret diplomatic messages began to fly back and forth between Berlin and Moscow through the summer of 1939. The culmination of this cynical courtship occurred on the night of August 23, 1939. Hitler's personal foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, arrived in Moscow on a special plane. He was driven directly through the dark streets to the Kremlin, where Stalin and Molotov were waiting for him. The meeting was fast, businesslike, and completely devoid of ideological friction. The fascists and the communists, who had spent the last decade screaming insults at each other in their respective presses, sat around a grand table, laughing, smoking, and drinking toasts to each other's health. Stalin raised a glass of wine and toasted Hitler, stating that he knew how much the German nation loved their Führer. By the early hours of the morning, they signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. To the public, it was announced as a simple, 10-year non-aggression treaty. The two nations promised not to attack each other and to remain neutral if either was dragged into a war with a third power. But the true heart of the agreement lay hidden inside a secret additional protocol that was withheld from the world. In this secret annex, Stalin and Hitler drew a line across the map of Eastern Europe, dividing entire independent nations into distinct spheres of influence. Germany took Western Poland and Lithuania. The Soviet Union was promised Eastern Poland, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and the province of Bessarabia from Romania. Stalin had effectively agreed to help Hitler launch the Second World War in exchange for a massive, imperial slice of territory. The public announcement of the Pact on August 24 sent a shockwave through the entire planet. It was an ideological earthquake. Communist workers across Europe, who had been told for years that fascism was their ultimate enemy, woke up to find photos of Stalin shaking hands with Nazi ministers on the front pages of their newspapers. Thousands left the communist parties in disgust and confusion. But Stalin cared nothing for their feelings. He viewed ideology as a weapon to control the masses, not a constraint on his own actions. To him, the Pact was a masterstroke of cold realism. He had bought the Soviet Union precious time to rebuild its army, and he had successfully turned the capitalist world against itself. 1 week later, on September 1, 1939, Hitler's armies crossed the border into Poland, igniting World War II. The German blitzkrieg smashed through the Polish defenses with terrifying speed. Stalin did not rush. He waited patiently for over 2 weeks, letting the German army do the heavy lifting and destroy the core of the Polish military resistance. Finally, on September 17, as the Polish government fled towards the Romanian border, Stalin ordered the Red Army to cross the eastern frontier. The Soviet public was told that the army was moving in as a peacekeeping force to protect their brother Ukrainians and Belarusians from the chaos. In reality, it was a coordinated imperial land grab. The Red Army met the German Wehrmacht in the middle of Poland, shaking hands, sharing cigarettes, and organizing joint military victory parades in cities like Brest-Litovsk. Stalin immediately moved to Sovietize his new territories, using the same brutal methods he had perfected during the purges. The NKVD, following close behind the advancing army, systematically arrested hundreds of thousands of Polish intellectuals, landowners, priests, and political figures. The most horrific manifestation of this occupation occurred in the spring of 1940. The Soviet forces had captured over 20,000 Polish military officers, policemen, and elite citizens. They were held in crowded prison camps in Western Russia and Ukraine. Stalin viewed these men as incurable class enemies who could never be integrated into a communist state. In March 1940, Lavrentiy Beria sent a memo to Stalin recommending the immediate execution of all Polish prisoners. Stalin took his thick blue pencil and scribbled his signature at the top of the page. Over the course of several weeks, NKVD executioners systematically shot 22,000 Polish officers in the back of the head, burying their bodies in hidden mass graves, most notably in the Katyn forest near Smolensk. When the vanished officers were later questioned by the Polish government in exile, Stalin lied calmly, suggesting they had escaped to Manchuria or disappeared in the chaos. Stalin continued his expansion through the summer of 1940. He sent ultimatums to the small Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, forcing them to accept Soviet troops before completely annexing them as Soviet republics. He launched a bloody, costly winter war against Finland, eventually forcing the heroic Finnish forces to cede strategic border territories after the Red Army suffered staggering losses due to incompetent leadership. To all appearances, Stalin's calculations had worked perfectly. France fell to the Germans in just 6 weeks in the summer of 1940, leaving Britain isolated and fighting for survival. Stalin believed the war in the West would drag on for years, exhausting both Germany and the British Empire, while the Soviet Union grew stronger and larger every day. But Stalin's brilliant geopolitical game was built upon a fatal flaw: his profound, stubborn misjudgment of Adolf Hitler's psychology. By the winter of 1940, Hitler grew tired of depending on Soviet oil and grain shipments, which Stalin meticulously delivered on time to avoid provoking the Germans. Hitler decided it was time to fulfill his ultimate racial dream. He signed Directive No. 21, code-named Operation Barbarossa, the total destruction of the Soviet Union. Through the spring of 1941, an enormous German military machine, over 3 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and hundreds of aircraft, systematically massed along the Soviet western border. The upcoming invasion was the worst-kept secret in modern history. Stalin's own master spies, including Richard Sorge in Tokyo and the Red Orchestra Network in Europe, sent highly detailed, accurate intelligence reports directly to the Kremlin. They provided the exact number of German divisions, their deployment positions, and even the precise date and hour set for the attack. Furthermore, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill sent personal, urgent letters to Stalin, warning him that his intelligence services had broken the German codes and that an invasion was imminent. Stalin reacted to these warnings with an extraordinary, furious denial. His paranoia, which usually made him suspect everyone around him, took a strange, inverted turn. He convinced himself that the intelligence reports were a massive, coordinated disinformation campaign organized by the British government. He believed that Churchill was desperately trying to trick the Soviet Union into launching a preemptive strike against Germany, which would ignite a war and save Britain from its isolation. Stalin became absolutely obsessed with avoiding any action that Hitler could interpret as a provocation. When Soviet border generals reported that German reconnaissance planes were flying deep into Soviet airspace every day, Stalin strictly forbade them from shooting the planes down. When frontline commanders begged to deploy their troops into defensive positions, Stalin refused, threatening to court-martial anyone who moved troops without his direct order. He ordered the state press to release furious statements denying any tension with Germany, branding the rumors as malicious capitalist lies. Even on the very night of June 21, 1941, as German sabotage units were actively cutting Soviet communication lines along the frontier, Soviet trains loaded with grain and oil were still rumbling west across the border into German territory, fulfilling the terms of the trade agreements. Stalin sat late into the night in his Kremlin office, surrounded by his terrified ministers, stubbornly insisting that Hitler was just trying to blackmail him for more economic concessions and would not dare to attack. He had successfully built a fortress of absolute denial around his own mind. The man of steel had survived the purges, outmaneuvered the old Bolsheviks, and signed a deadly pact to outsmart the world. But his absolute certainty that he was the smartest man in the room was about to bring the Soviet Union to the very brink of total annihilation. At exactly 3:30 on the morning of June 22, 1941, the pre-dawn stillness along the western frontier of the Soviet Union was shattered by a deafening roar. Thousands of heavy German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, lighting up the eastern horizon. Minutes later, waves of modern Luftwaffe bombers roared across the border, dropping payloads on sleeping cities, crowded railway junctions, and forward military airfields. On the ground, 3 million highly trained soldiers of the German Wehrmacht, organized into massive armored columns, rolled forward across the frontier. Operation Barbarossa had begun. In the early hours of the invasion, the Soviet military command collapsed into absolute chaos. Hundreds of Soviet fighter planes were destroyed on the ground before their pilots could even reach the cockpits. Communication lines were severed almost instantly by German sabotage units, leaving frontline generals completely blind. They had no idea where the enemy was, where their own troops were, or what actions to take. When the first frantic phone calls reached the Kremlin in the middle of the night, Stalin's inner circle was paralyzed by fear. No one wanted to wake the master with the terrifying news. Finally, Marshal Georgy Zhukov called Stalin's private apartment. When Stalin answered, his voice was heavy with sleep. Zhukov explained that the Germans were bombing Kiev, Minsk, Sevastopol, and Kaunas. There was a long, suffocating silence on the line. The only sound Zhukov could hear was the heavy, labored breathing of the general secretary. Stalin's first reaction was not fury, but a stubborn, desperate refusal to accept reality. He suggested that this was not a real war, but a rogue provocation by independent German generals who were trying to drag him into a conflict. He strictly ordered his commanders to return fire only on the border, but forbid them from crossing the frontier or launching counterattacks into German territory. He was still desperately trying not to provoke Hitler, completely oblivious to the fact that the Nazi dictator had already unleashed total war. It took hours for the absolute truth to pierce Stalin's wall of denial. As report after report arrived detailing the catastrophic collapse of the entire front line, the psychological blow broke something deep inside the man of steel. The brilliant geopolitical game he had played with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had failed catastrophically. His absolute certainty that he could outsmart Hitler had brought his country to the absolute brink of ruin. Stalin retreated to his private Kremlin office, surrounded by his ministers, Molotov, Beria, Malenkov, and Voroshilov. His face was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and his hands shook as he tried to light his pipe. When Molotov went on the state radio at noon to formally announce the German invasion to the Soviet people, it was a striking admission of weakness. Stalin was too emotionally shattered to speak to his own nation. By the end of June, the situation grew exponentially worse. The German panzer divisions, utilizing their rapid blitzkrieg tactics, easily bypassed the static Soviet border defenses. They executed massive pincer movements, trapping entire Soviet armies in giant pockets. Outside Minsk, over 300,000 Soviet soldiers were surrounded, killed, or captured in a matter of days. The road to Moscow was opening wide. Faced with this total disaster, Stalin suffered a complete nervous breakdown. On June 28, after learning that Minsk had fallen to the enemy, Stalin walked out of the defense ministry in a state of utter despair. He turned to his ministers and muttered bitterly, "Lenin left us a great state and we have turned it to shit." He left the Kremlin entirely, got into his car and drove down to his private dacha at Kontsevo. He shut himself inside his room, refused to answer the telephone, and withdrew into absolute isolation. For 3 long days, the supreme leader of the Soviet Union effectively disappeared from the face of the earth, while the German armies continued their relentless advance into the heart of the country. On June 30, a delegation of his top ministers, Beria, Molotov, Malenkov, and Voroshilov, drove out to the Kontsevo dacha. They were terrified. The country was leaderless in the middle of the greatest crisis in its history, and they needed to establish a state defense committee to run the war. When they walked into Stalin's room, the scene was extraordinary. Stalin was sitting slumped in an armchair, looking disheveled, hollow-eyed, and exhausted. When he looked up at his ministers, his face twisted into an expression of naked fear. Because he had spent his entire life purging, arresting, and shooting his colleagues, Stalin assumed that his ministers had come to arrest him for his catastrophic failures at the start of the war. He looked at them and asked quietly, "Why have you come?" Molotov, speaking for the group, quickly reassured him. They had not come to arrest him. They had come to beg him to take absolute control of the war effort. They told him that only he possessed the authority to unite the country and lead the resistance. Stalin breathed a quiet sigh of relief. His confidence returned instantly, replacing his paralyzing fear with an icy determination. He accepted the post of Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. The breakdown was over. The warlord had returned. On July 3, 1941, Stalin finally addressed the Soviet people over the state radio. The millions of citizens who gathered around the public loudspeakers across the country heard a completely different Stalin. He did not sound like a cold, dry communist bureaucrat or a harsh dictator. His voice was trembling, slow, and deeply emotional. He did not begin his speech with the standard communist greeting of comrades. Instead, he reached back into his Georgian roots and his childhood seminary training, addressing the population as equals in suffering. "Brothers and sisters, my friends, I appeal to you, my citizens." In the speech, Stalin hid nothing about the extreme danger facing the motherland. He called for an absolute, uncompromising scorched earth policy. He ordered that, as the Red Army retreated, nothing must be left for the advancing enemy. Every train engine, every pound of grain, every cow, and every gallon of fuel must be destroyed or shipped east. He ordered the creation of partisan detachments to wage a merciless guerrilla war in the forests behind the German lines. Crucially, Stalin shifted the entire ideology of the war. He stopped talking about the global proletarian revolution or the triumph of communism. He invoked the deep, historic spirit of traditional Russian patriotism, calling on the people to defend Mother Russia against the foreign invaders. As the summer turned to autumn, the German war machine continued to grind forward, but the nature of the war was changing. Stalin's scorched earth orders and the desperate resistance of ordinary Soviet soldiers, who fought to the death even when completely surrounded, began to slow the German advance. Stalin made a critical decision that saved the economy. He ordered the absolute evacuation of the country's entire industrial base. Thousands of factories in Western Russia and Ukraine were systematically dismantled, piece by piece, packed onto millions of railway cars, and shipped thousands of miles east to the Ural Mountains, Siberia, and Central Asia. In the middle of winter, working in the open air without roofs over their heads, Soviet workers reassembled the machinery and began producing tanks and planes at an astonishing rate. By October 1941, the ultimate crisis arrived. The German armies launched Operation Typhoon, the final, massive push to capture Moscow before the winter set in. The German panzers smashed through the last defensive lines, arriving just 20 miles outside the city outskirts. German officers could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. A massive, uncontrollable panic gripped the capital. The government ordered a partial evacuation of the city, sending ministries, foreign diplomats, and state treasures east to the city of Kuibyshev. Millions of ordinary citizens rushed to the railway stations, clambering onto trains, while looting broke out in the streets. A train was prepared at the station to carry Stalin away from the capital. Stalin faced a monumental choice that would determine the fate of the war. He walked up and down the platform, staring at the waiting train carriage. The German generals expected him to flee. His own ministers advised him to leave. But Stalin understood the psychological weight of the capital. He knew that if Moscow fell, the morale of the entire nation would break permanently. He turned away from the train and returned to his office in the Kremlin. He announced that he would remain in Moscow, and he declared a state of siege in the city. To prove his absolute certainty of victory, Stalin ordered an extraordinary act of political defiance. Every year on November 7, the state held a grand military parade in Red Square to celebrate the anniversary of the October Revolution. With the German army only miles away, most officials assumed the parade would be cancelled. Stalin refused. On the snowy morning of November 7, 1941, as dark clouds hung low over the capital, Stalin stood on top of Lenin's mausoleum. The square was packed with thousands of Red Army soldiers dressed in heavy winter gear, their bayonets fixed. Stalin addressed the troops directly, his voice echoing through the cold air. He invoked the names of great Russian historical heroes, Alexander Nevsky, Dmitry Donskoy, and Mikhail Kutuzov, who had defeated foreign invaders in the past. As soon as Stalin finished speaking, the regiments turned, marched out of Red Square, and went directly to the front line to enter combat. The psychological effect on the nation was immense. If Stalin was still standing in the Kremlin, then Russia was not defeated. The ultimate ally Stalin was waiting for finally arrived in late November, the Russian winter. The temperatures plummeted to -30 degrees, and heavy snow buried the landscape. The German army, which Hitler had confidently predicted would win the war in the summer, had not been issued winter uniforms. Their oil froze in their tank engines, their weapons jammed, and thousands of German soldiers suffered from severe frostbite. Simultaneously, Stalin's master spy in Tokyo, Richard Sorge, delivered a final, guaranteed intelligence report. Japan was planning to strike the United States in the Pacific and would not attack the Soviet Union from the east. Stalin seized this moment. He ordered dozens of elite, fresh, winter-hardened Siberian divisions, who had been guarding the eastern border, to be rapidly shipped west by rail. On December 5, 1941, Stalin unleashed these fresh Siberian forces, commanded by Marshal Zhukov, in a massive, unexpected counteroffensive outside the gates of Moscow. The frozen, exhausted German lines shattered under the weight of the blow. The Wehrmacht was thrown back over 100 miles from the capital, suffering its very first major strategic defeat of the entire war. Moscow was saved. As Stalin stood at his window in the Kremlin, looking out at the snow falling over the ancient stone towers, he knew the immediate danger of total annihilation had passed. The Soviet Union had survived the terrifying brink of Operation Barbarossa. The road ahead was still incredibly long, filled with millions more casualties and catastrophic battles like Stalingrad. But the man of steel had successfully steadied the failing front, transformed himself into a national warlord, and dug his heels into the frozen earth, ready to fight a war of absolute exhaustion until the Nazi monster was utterly destroyed. The victory outside the gates of Moscow in the freezing December of 1941 gave the Soviet Union a brief, precious moment to breathe. For the first time since the terrifying morning of Operation Barbarossa, the German Wehrmacht had been forced to retreat. Stalin had stabilized the front line and preserved the heart of his empire, but the cost had been catastrophic. Millions of Red Army soldiers were dead, captured, or wounded, and huge swaths of productive Soviet territory remained under the brutal boot of Nazi occupation. Stalin knew that the German war machine was wounded, but it was far from dead. As the spring of 1942 arrived, and the vast snows of the Russian plains melted into thick, deep mud, both sides prepared for the next phase of the titanic struggle. Stalin, inflated by the success of the Moscow counteroffensive, initially demanded a massive, simultaneous attack across the entire length of the front line. His top military commander, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, urged caution, arguing that the Red Army still lacked the training, tanks, and artillery to sustain such a massive offensive. Zhukov was right. Stalin's premature attacks in the spring of 1942, particularly a disastrous offensive near Kharkiv, resulted in the encirclement and loss of hundreds of thousands of fresh Soviet troops. Adolf Hitler took immediate advantage of these Soviet blunders. The German dictator realized he no longer had the strength to launch an attack across the entire Soviet border as he had done in 1941. Instead, he gathered his elite armored divisions for a massive, concentrated strike in the south. Hitler's strategic goal was clear and lethal. Case Blue, Fall Blau. He intended to drive his armies across the southern steppes to seize the vast oil fields of the Caucasus, which supplied over 80% of the Soviet Union's fuel. Without oil, Stalin's tanks would stop, his airplanes would fall from the sky, and his industrial factories would grind to a halt. To protect the left flank of this massive drive toward the oil fields, Hitler ordered his Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, to advance on a major industrial city sprawling along the western bank of the Volga River. The city bore the name of the Soviet dictator himself, Stalingrad. By July 1942, the German southern offensive exploded forward with terrifying speed. The panzer divisions tore through the open, flat steppes, kicking up massive clouds of dust as they drove toward the Volga. The retreating Red Army struggled to form a coherent line of defense. Panic began to spread through the ranks once again, mirroring the dark days of 1941. Stalin watched the unfolding disaster from his dimly lit office in the Kremlin with a cold, mounting fury. He understood the stakes perfectly. If Stalingrad fell, the Germans would cut off the vital transport artery of the Volga River, preventing any oil from reaching the factories and armies in the north. Furthermore, the loss of a city bearing his own name would be a psychological catastrophe, a devastating blow to national morale that he could not allow. On July 28, 1942, Stalin signed one of the most famous, ruthless, and controversial documents in modern military history, Order No. 227. It became known across the nation by its brutal, single-sentence slogan, "Not a step back, Ni Shagu Nazad." Order No. 227 was a document written in blood and absolute desperation. Stalin declared that the Soviet Union had no more land to give, no more space to retreat. He ordered that any commander or soldier who retreated from his position without a direct written command from the high military leadership would be considered a traitor to the motherland. The order established penal battalions, SH Strafbats, made up of disgraced officers and soldiers who were forced to redeem their sins by undertaking the most dangerous, suicidal missions on the front line. Crucially, Order No. 227 mandated the creation of blocking detachments, Zagradatriadi staffed by armed NKVD units. These detachments were stationed directly behind the front-line units. Their instructions were clear, simple, and merciless. If a Soviet unit panicked, broke formation, and attempted to retreat, the NKVD troops were to open fire on their own men with machine guns to stop the flight. Stalin used total terror to conquer total fear, forcing his soldiers to choose between the certain death of an NKVD bullet in the rear or the possible death of a German bullet in the front. By late August 1942, General Paulus's Sixth Army arrived at the northern outskirts of Stalingrad. On August 23, hundreds of Luftwaffe bombers filled the sky over the city, unleashing a horrific, non-stop carpet-bombing campaign that transformed a thriving metropolis of 500,000 people into a smoking, blackened wasteland of shattered brick and twisted steel. Over 40,000 civilians died in a single day. Stalin strictly forbade the evacuation of civilians from the city, ruthlessly arguing that the Red Army soldiers would fight harder to defend the buildings if they knew they were protecting living women and children trapped in the cellars. In September, the German infantry pushed into the ruined center of Stalingrad. What followed was a battle the world had never seen before, a hellish, claustrophobic war of attrition that the German soldiers bitterly nicknamed Rattenkrieg, Rat War. The massive tactical advantages of the German Blitzkrieg, their rapid tank movements and coordinated airstrikes, were completely neutralized by the ruins. The battle dissolved into thousands of isolated, primitive duels fought between small groups of men inside individual factories, shattered apartment complexes, sewers, and cellars. Stalin placed General Vasily Chuikov in command of the 62nd Army, defending the city ruins. Chuikov adopted a brilliant, desperate tactic, hugging the enemy. He ordered his men to keep their defensive lines within stone's throw of the German positions, often separated by nothing more than a single brick wall or a floor in an apartment building. This prevented the Germans from using their heavy artillery or air support, because any strike would kill their own soldiers along with the Soviets. The legendary landmarks of the city became synonymous with absolute slaughter. Men fought for weeks over the grain elevator, a massive concrete structure where the air was thick with smoke and burning dust. They fought endlessly for the Red October factory, the Bureaucratic gun factory, and the tractor factory, where workers continued to build and repair tanks under direct artillery fire, driving them straight out of the factory doors into combat. Snipers became the kings of the ruins. Stalin's propaganda machine heavily promoted the exploits of figures like Vasily Zaitsev, a shepherd from the Urals who killed over 200 German soldiers with his scoped rifle, turning the rubble of Stalingrad into an invisible, psychological minefield for the invaders. Every single night, under the cover of darkness and heavy German artillery fire, small wooden boats and ferries crossed the wide Volga River from the eastern bank. They brought fresh, terrorized Soviet recruits, ammunition, and basic medical supplies into the burning inferno of the city. The average life expectancy of a newly arrived Soviet soldier in Stalingrad was less than 24 hours. Yet, despite suffering staggering losses, Chuikov's men held onto a tiny, narrow strip of land along the riverbank, refusing to surrender the final piers. While the world's attention was completely transfixed by the epic, bloody struggle inside the ruins of Stalingrad, Stalin and his top military minds, Zhukov and Alexander Vasylovsky, were quietly planning a massive, brilliant counterstroke. Stalin had learned the bitter lessons of 1941 and early 1942. He no longer micromanaged every single platoon movement or demanded wild, impossible offenses across the entire continent. He listened to his professional generals, gave them the resources they needed, and allowed them to plan in absolute secrecy. Zhukov realized that Hitler had committed an enormous strategic error. In his obsessive determination to capture the city of Stalingrad, Hitler had thrown almost all his elite German divisions into the city center. To protect the vast, hundreds of miles-long flanks to the north and south of the city, the Germans relied on poorly equipped, unmotivated armies composed of their Axis allies, the Romanians, Italians, and Hungarians. These troops lacked anti-tank weapons, heavy artillery, and the will to fight a total war for a German empire. The Soviet plan was codenamed Operation Uranus. For months, while Chuikov's men bled the German Sixth Army dry inside the ruins, Stalin secretly massed over 1 million fresh troops, thousands of heavy artillery pieces, and modern T-34 tanks in the deep forests and ravines north and south of Stalingrad. The secret movement of these massive armies by rail and foot was executed with flawless discipline. On the foggy morning of November 19, 1942, Stalin unleashed the trap. Thousands of Soviet Katyusha rocket launchers and heavy guns opened fire on the Romanian lines north of the city, their deafening screams tearing through the winter air. Minutes later, massive columns of Soviet tanks slammed into the defensive positions. The poorly equipped Romanian troops collapsed almost instantly, fleeing in panic across the snow. The next day, November 20, the Southern Soviet Claw launched its attack, easily crushing the Romanian forces on the southern flank. On November 23, just 4 days after the operation began, the two fast-moving Soviet tank columns met at the tiny town of Kalach, bridging the Don River. The pincer movement was complete. With a single, brilliant blow, Stalin's generals had surrounded the entire German 6th Army and parts of the 4th Panzer Army. Over 250,000 elite German soldiers, along with thousands of horses, guns, and vehicles, inside a giant frozen pocket known as the Kessel cauldron. Hitler was stunned, but he refused to allow General Paulus to attempt a breakout to the west. The Nazi leader listened to the hollow promises of his Air Force chief, Hermann Göring, who claimed the Luftwaffe could fly in all the food, fuel, and ammunition the trapped army needed. It was a complete fantasy. The winter blizzards, sub-zero temperatures, and effective Soviet anti-aircraft fire brought the aerial supply line to a quick collapse. The trapped German soldiers were left to rot in the open snow fields, starving, freezing, and running out of ammunition. In December, a desperate German rescue attempt led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein tried to punch through the Soviet ring from the south, but Stalin's fresh reserves held the line with unyielding determination, throwing the German panzers back. The fate of the 6th Army was sealed permanently. In January 1943, Stalin placed General Konstantin Rokossovsky in charge of Operation Ring, the final destruction of the surrounded enemy. The Red Army systematically squeezed the pocket, driving the starving, frostbitten German soldiers back into the ruined city center they had destroyed a few months earlier. On January 30, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. In German history, no German field marshal had ever been captured alive. Hitler was subtly ordering Paulus to commit suicide for the honor of the Reich. Paulus refused. On January 31, Soviet soldiers discovered Paulus's hidden headquarters in the basement of a ruined department store. A young Soviet lieutenant walked down the dark stairs and accepted the surrender of the broken, shivering field marshal. On February 2, 1943, the final German resistance inside the factories of Stalingrad ceased entirely. Over 90,000 German soldiers, walking like ghosts in their ragged, frozen clothes, marched into a brutal, long Soviet captivity. The vast majority of them would never return home. The victory at Stalingrad was a turning point that transformed the entire course of World War II. It was a victory bought at an unimaginable human cost. The Red Army suffered over 1 million casualties in the defense and counteroffensive of the city, a number greater than the total military losses of Britain and the United States combined for the entire war. But the strategic and psychological impact was absolute. The myth of German invincibility was shattered forever. The German army had lost an entire elite army, along with its initiative, its momentum, and its hope of conquering the Soviet Empire. In Moscow, the church bells rang, and the state radio played triumphant military marches. Stalin, sitting in his Kremlin office, put on a new, grand military uniform. He appointed himself Marshal of the Soviet Union. He had survived the purges, outlasted the terrifying collapse of 1941, and used the brutal discipline of Order No. 227 to forge an unbreakable wall of human flesh. The Man of Steel had broken the back of the Nazi monster on the banks of the Volga, and from this moment on, the massive, red tide of the Soviet Union would only roll westward, driving relentlessly toward the heart of Berlin. In May 1945, the guns finally fell silent across Europe. The Nazi monster that had threatened to wipe the Soviet Union from the map was completely destroyed. In Moscow, millions of people poured into the streets, weeping, hugging, and dancing under skies lit up by magnificent victory fireworks. On June 24, a grand victory parade marched across the damp stones of Red Square. Red Army soldiers marched past the Kremlin, proudly throwing captured Nazi banners and Hitler's personal standard into the dirt at the foot of Lenin's mausoleum. Stalin stood on top of the tomb, wearing a new, specially designed uniform of a Generalissimo. He had reached the absolute peak of his global power. To his people and to the world, he was no longer just the ruler of a state. He was the master strategist who had saved civilization from fascism. But beneath the glorious celebration lay a reality of unimaginable devastation. The war had torn the Soviet Union apart. More than 27 million Soviet citizens were dead. The western provinces of the country, which had been the heart of its industry and agriculture, were transformed into a wasteland of smoking ruins. Thousands of cities, towns, and villages were completely leveled. Millions of people were homeless, living in mud huts or dugouts in the earth. The factories that had survived were exhausted, and the collective farms were stripped of horses, tractors, and young men. Stalin looked at this broken empire and knew that his victory was deeply fragile. He also knew that the geopolitical landscape had changed forever. The old European powers, Britain and France, were bankrupt and weak. The global stage was now dominated by just two superpowers: the United States, wealthy and armed with the terrifying power of the atomic bomb, and the Soviet Union, wounded but possessing the largest land army in the world. The Grand Alliance that had defeated Hitler was dissolving rapidly, replaced by a cold, tense standoff that would shape the rest of the century. Stalin's primary goal in the post-war world was absolute security. He was determined to ensure that the Soviet Union would never again be vulnerable to an invasion from the West. His solution was to build a massive geographic buffer zone. During the wartime conferences at Yalta and Potsdam, Stalin outmaneuvered the aging American President Franklin Roosevelt and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He secured agreements that left the territories liberated by the Red Army under Soviet military occupation. Systematically, over the next 3 years, Stalin turned these liberated countries into puppet states. In Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia, the Soviet authorities used what the Hungarian communist leader Matyas Rákosi called salami tactics. They cut away the non-communist political parties piece by piece. First, the Red Army and the local secret police arrested popular democratic leaders, accusing them of collaborating with the fascists. Next, they rigged national elections to ensure communist victories. Finally, they banned all opposition, censored the newspapers, and established totalitarian regimes modeled exactly on Stalin's Soviet Union. In March 1946, Winston Churchill, now out of power, traveled to the United States and delivered a famous speech that defined this new reality. He declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent of Europe, dividing the democratic West from the Soviet-controlled East. Stalin reacted with public fury, comparing Churchill to Hitler and arguing that the Soviet Union was simply ensuring it had friendly neighbors. In reality, Stalin had successfully rebuilt the old Tsarist empire under the red flag, extending his personal control deep into the heart of Central Europe. The confrontation between East and West escalated dramatically in 1947 when the United States launched the Marshall Plan. This was a massive multi-billion-dollar economic aid package designed to help European nations rebuild their ruined economies. The Americans offered the money to every European country, including the Soviet Union and its new satellites. Stalin saw the Marshall Plan as a brilliant, dangerous trap. He believed the Americans were using their immense wealth to buy political influence and tie the European economies to Washington. He feared that if his satellite states accepted American dollars, they would slip out of his orbit. Stalin strictly forbade Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the other Eastern European governments from participating. When the Czechoslovak government initially voted to accept the aid, Stalin summoned their ministers to Moscow and terrified them into reversing their decision. In place of the Marshall Plan, Stalin established his own economic system, forcing the Eastern European economies to integrate directly with Moscow, exporting their raw materials to the Soviet Union at artificially low prices. The ultimate flashpoint of this early Cold War occurred in the divided city of Berlin. After the war, Germany had been split into 4 occupation zones, and Berlin, located deep inside the Soviet zone, was similarly divided among the Allies. In June 1948, the Western powers introduced a new, stable currency in their zones to stimulate economic recovery. Stalin viewed this as a direct threat to his plans for Germany. He responded with absolute force, launching the Berlin blockade. He ordered Soviet troops to cut off all highways, railways, and canal routes connecting Western Germany to Berlin. He intended to starve the 2 million citizens of West Berlin into submission, forcing the Western Allies to abandon the city. Stalin believed the West would back down rather than risk a new world war. He miscalculated the determination of his opponents. The United States and Britain responded with the Berlin airlift. For 11 long months, Western cargo planes landed in Berlin every few minutes, flying in millions of tons of food, coal, and medicine. Stalin watched in silent frustration as his blockade failed to break the city. Realizing that he could not stop the planes without shooting them down and starting a war he was not ready for, Stalin quietly lifted the blockade in May 1949. The crisis solidified the division of Germany into 2 separate states, the democratic West Germany and the communist East Germany. While Stalin fought these geopolitical battles on the diplomatic front, he was deeply obsessed with a secret project inside the Soviet Union. He knew that as long as the United States held a monopoly on the atomic bomb, the Soviet Union was at a tremendous disadvantage. Shortly after the American attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, Stalin summoned his top scientists and his most ruthless administrator, Lavrentiy Beria. He placed Beria in absolute charge of the Soviet atomic program. Stalin told his team that the balance of the world depended on them, and he gave them unlimited resources. Beria turned the project into an extension of the Gulag system. He built secret, closed research cities in the wilderness, guarded by barbed wire and NKVD troops. Hundreds of thousands of prison laborers were forced to mine uranium with their bare hands under horrific conditions, dying of radiation sickness in the forests. Simultaneously, Stalin's sophisticated espionage network, which had penetrated the American Manhattan Project during the war through idealistic spies like Klaus Fuchs, delivered highly detailed blueprints of the American bomb directly to Soviet physicists. Armed with this stolen data and the absolute labor of the Gulag, the Soviet scientists worked at a frantic pace. On August 29, 1949, in the remote deserts of Kazakhstan, the Soviet Union successfully detonated its very first atomic bomb. When the American government announced the news to a shocked public, Stalin smiled. The American atomic monopoly was broken, and the Cold War entered a new, even more dangerous era of nuclear balance. Inside the Soviet Union, the brief hope for a better, freer life after the victory evaporated almost instantly. The millions of Red Army soldiers who had marched through Germany, Austria, and Poland had seen something dangerous. They had seen that ordinary citizens in capitalist countries enjoyed a far higher standard of living than Soviet citizens. They had seen decent houses, paved roads, and abundant consumer goods. Stalin viewed this exposure to the West as a dangerous ideological infection that could destabilize his regime. He acted with his usual preemptive brutality. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers who had been captured by the Germans during the war and survived the horrific Nazi prison camps were treated not as heroes, but as traitors. Stalin believed that anyone who fell into enemy hands was a potential spy or a coward. When these unfortunate prisoners were repatriated to the Soviet Union at the end of the war, they were taken directly from the trains, loaded into cattle cars, and shipped straight to the Gulag to serve long sentences of hard labor. Stalin also launched a fierce domestic campaign to reassert absolute ideological control over the population. He placed Andrei Zhdanov, a fanatical cultural commissar, in charge of a vicious campaign known as the Zhdanovshchina. The goal was to wipe out any trace of Western influence or independent thought in Soviet culture. The state targeted the country's finest writers, poets, and musicians. Great figures like the poet Anna Akhmatova and the author Mikhail Zhishchenko were publicly denounced as bourgeois degenerates, expelled from the writers' union, and stripped of their livelihoods. The world-famous composers Sergei Prokofiev and Dmitri Shostakovich were accused of writing music that was too complex and alien to the Soviet working class. They were forced to make humiliating public apologies and write simple, patriotic songs praising Stalin to save themselves from arrest. Every book, play, painting, and symphony had to conform to the rigid rules of socialist realism, praising the achievements of the state and the genius of the leader. As Stalin grew older, his isolation and his lifelong paranoia intensified to an almost pathological degree. He spent less time in the Kremlin and more time secluded inside his heavily guarded dacha at Kontsevo, surrounded by high concrete walls and legions of security guards. He mistrusted his closest ministers, Beria, Molotov, Malenkov, and Khrushchev. He would force them to drive out to his dacha late at night, where he made them sit through long, uncomfortable dinners that lasted until dawn. He watched them constantly, forcing them to drink heavily while he remained sober, hoping they would slip up and reveal some hidden treachery. He routinely shuffled their positions, whispering to one that another was plotting against him, keeping his inner circle in a state of permanent, paralyzing fear. In 1949, Stalin turned his terror back inward against the party itself in a series of secret events known as the Leningrad Affair. He convinced himself that the young, capable leaders of the Leningrad Party organization, who had heroically managed the city during the terrible wartime siege, were becoming too independent from Moscow. He ordered their sudden arrest. Top officials, including Nikolai Voznesensky, the brilliant economic planner who had managed the wartime industry, were tortured in the basements of the secret police and shot without a public trial. Stalin wanted to remind every bureaucrat in the nation that no matter how great their wartime achievements were, their lives belonged entirely to him. In his final years, Stalin's paranoia took a deeply dark, anti-Semitic turn. He launched a massive propaganda campaign against what the state newspapers called rootless cosmopolitans, a thinly veiled code word for Soviet Jews. He accused Jewish intellectuals, writers, and artists of being agents of American imperialism and international Zionism. The Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, an organization he had created during the war to gather foreign support for the Soviet Union, was dissolved. Its leaders were arrested, tortured, and secretly executed in August 1952 during the Night of the Murdered Poets. The climax of this final wave of terror arrived in late 1952 with the fabrication of the Doctor's plot. Stalin's personal physician, Vladimir Vinogradov, had suggested that the aging leader needed to reduce his workload to protect his failing health. Stalin erupted in fury, interpreting this medical advice as a hidden assassination plot. He ordered the arrest of the Kremlin's elite doctors, most of whom were Jewish. Stalin personally directed the interrogation methods from his dacha, writing angry notes to the secret police chiefs demanding they beat the doctors until they confessed. He told them, "If you do not obtain confessions from the doctors, we will shorten you by a head." The state media soon announced that a terrorist group of bourgeois specialist doctors had been uncovered, claiming they had intentionally murdered top Soviet leaders like Zhdanov, and were plotting to poison the high command of the Red Army on behalf of American and British intelligence. The nation was frozen in terror once again. Rumors spread rapidly that Stalin was preparing a massive, public show trial in Red Square, to be followed by the mass deportation of the entire Jewish population of the Soviet Union to remote camps in Siberia. By the early months of 1953, the atmosphere in Moscow was thick with suspicion, fear, and the unmistakable scent of a new great purge. The machinery of terror that Stalin had spent decades perfecting was humming once again, poised to strike the elite of the nation. The man of steel, now a frail, paranoid old man trembling in the silence of his country house, had successfully frozen his empire in a state of permanent fear, proving that even as his own body was failing, his absolute power over the lives of millions remained unbroken. The heavy winter of 1953 hung over Moscow like a shroud of gray iron. Inside the Kremlin, the atmosphere was thick with a familiar, suffocating fear. Stalin was now 73 years old, but age had not softened the man of steel. It had only sharpened his paranoia into a razor edge. The grand victory over Nazi Germany was 8 years in the past, and the Soviet Union had rebuilt its cities and exploded its own atomic bomb. Yet, Stalin felt more vulnerable than ever. He looked around his inner circle, at the smooth, deadly spymaster Lavrentiy Beria, the unblinking Vyacheslav Molotov, the rising bureaucrat Nikita Khrushchev, and the quiet Georgy Malenkov, and saw only plotting eyes. In these final months, Stalin was preparing the machinery for a new great terror. He had already unleashed the Doctor's plot, announcing to the public that a group of prominent Kremlin physicians, mostly Jewish, were working for Western intelligence agencies to poison the Soviet leadership. The newspapers screamed with anti-Semitic propaganda, prisons were filling up, and the torture chambers of the Lubyanka were operating at full capacity once more. The veteran members of the Politburo knew the signs all too well. They recognized the cold glint in Stalin's eyes. They knew that when a new purge began, the people closest to the throne were always the first to be pushed into the abyss. To escape the oppressive weight of the Kremlin, Stalin spent almost all his time at his favorite residence, the Kuntsevo Dacha. Located just a few miles outside the Moscow city limits, the Dacha was a low, dark green fortress hidden behind a double ring of high wooden fences, guarded by hundreds of heavily armed MGB secret police agents. The house was designed to Stalin's exact, paranoid specifications. All the rooms looked identical. The furniture was plain and the windows were made of bulletproof glass. Every night, Stalin would choose a different bedroom to sleep in at the very last minute, terrified that an assassin might learn his routine. On the evening of Saturday, February 28, 1953, Stalin followed his usual wartime routine. He invited his inner circle, Beria, Khrushchev, Malenkov, and Nikolai Bulganin, to the Kremlin for a private movie screening. Afterward, the group drove out to the Kuncevo Dacha for a late-night dinner. The dinner was a classic grueling Stalinist banquet. It lasted until 4 o'clock on Sunday morning. Under Stalin's watchful eye, the guests drank massive amounts of Georgian wine, laughed at crude jokes, and desperately tried to gauge the dictator's mood. Stalin himself was in a strange, talkative state, drinking mixed wines and lecturing his subordinates about the history of the party. When the exhaustion finally took over, Stalin dismissed his guests. Khrushchev later recalled that Stalin seemed in good spirits, playfully poking him in the stomach and calling him Nikita. The ministers piled into their black limousines and sped away into the snow, relieved to have survived another night in the lion's den. Stalin retired to his private apartments. He explicitly told his head guard, Pavel Lozgashev, that he was going to sleep and did not want to be disturbed under any circumstances. The heavy internal doors clicked shut, and the absolute silence of the dacha took hold. Sunday, March 1, began as a quiet winter day. In the guards' quarters and the kitchen, the staff waited for the usual signs of life from Stalin's rooms. Typically, Stalin woke up between 11 o'clock and noon. When he woke, a small light would activate on the central switchboard, indicating that he was moving through the house or ready for his morning tea. Noon arrived and the board remained dark. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, there was still no sound, no light, and no movement. The guards began to feel a cold knot of anxiety tightening in their stomachs. To enter Stalin's private quarters without an explicit invitation was a capital offense. People had been sent to the Gulag or shot for far less. They convinced themselves that the comrade general secretary was simply exhausted from the long night of drinking and was sleeping late. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the sun had set and the dacha was cast into darkness. Still, no light flickered inside Stalin's windows. The tension among the staff was now unbearable. They paced the corridors, looking at the heavy wooden doors, terrified to knock, yet equally terrified of the consequences if something was wrong and they did nothing. Finally, at around 10 o'clock at night, a delivery of official mail and documents arrived from the Kremlin Central Committee. This gave the staff a legitimate excuse to break the rules. Lozgashev took the documents, gathered his courage, and walked down the long, carpeted corridor toward the small dining room. When Lozgashev opened the door, a terrifying sight met his eyes. The room was softly lit by a single lamp. Stalin was lying flat on his back on the patterned rug next to the table. He was wearing his pajama trousers and a stained undershirt. His body was rigid, and his right hand was half raised, as if he had been trying to reach for help before he fell. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, but they were completely devoid of intelligence. He was soaked in his own urine and could only emit a faint, guttural, scratching sound. Caw, caw. A half-empty bottle of mineral water and a glass lay shattered on the floor beside him. He had suffered a massive, catastrophic stroke, likely early that morning, and had spent the last 15 hours lying helpless and alone on the cold floor, trapped inside the absolute terror he had built around himself. Lozgashev panicked. He ran to the telephone and called the Ministry of State Security, but the top officials were too terrified to make a decision without the Politburo. Lozgashev then phoned the Kuncevo Dacha's direct line to the Kremlin leadership. The first person he managed to reach was Georgy Malenkov. Malenkov, paralyzed by fear, immediately called Lavrentiy Beria. What happened over the next several hours remains one of the most chilling chapters in Soviet history. Instead of rushing a team of top medical specialists to the Dacha to save the dying leader, the ministers did the exact opposite. They delayed. Beria and Malenkov arrived at the Dacha around 1 o'clock on Monday morning, March 2. They walked into the room where Stalin had been moved onto a sofa. Beria looked down at the helpless, breathing body of the dictator. For decades, Beria had lived with the absolute certainty that Stalin would eventually execution him. Now, fate had handed him a miracle. Beria turned furiously to the terrified guards and shouted, "Why are you panicking? Can't you see Comrade Stalin is fast asleep? Don't disturb him. Stop making a fuss." Beria and Malenkov turned around, got back into their cars, and left. They left the ruler of the Soviet Union without a single doctor, without a drop of medicine, and without any medical assistance for several more critical hours. It was a silent coup by omission. The inner circle wanted to be absolutely certain that the man of steel was too far gone to ever recover, because if Stalin woke up with his mind intact, he would know they had seen him weak, and he would destroy them all. It was not until sunrise on Monday, March 2, nearly 30 hours after the stroke had occurred, that a group of terrified, shaking doctors was finally permitted to enter the Kuntsivo Dacha. By this time, Khrushchev, Bulganin, Molotov, and the rest of the leadership had arrived to watch the vigil. The scene around Stalin's deathbed was surreal. The doctors were so consumed by fear that their hands trembled violently as they tried to examine him. They knew that if Stalin died under their care, they could easily be accused of assassinating him as part of the doctors' plot. They had to carefully remove his shirt, take his blood pressure, and apply leeches to his ears to draw blood away from his brain, all while the top executioners of the empire stood behind them, watching their every move. The medical diagnosis was absolute. A massive hemorrhage had destroyed the left hemisphere of Stalin's brain. His right side was completely paralyzed, and he was completely unconscious. For the next 3 days, Stalin's agony dragged on. The Dacha turned into a silent theater of political transition. The members of the Politburo gathered in the adjoining rooms, speaking in whispers. They were already dividing the empire among themselves. Malenkov would take the government. Beria would control the secret police. Khrushchev would take the party apparatus. Whenever Stalin showed the slightest sign of movement, the ministers would rush to his bedside, their faces twisted into masks of deep, hypocritical grief. The moment he sank back into unconsciousness, their expressions changed to cold calculation. Svetlana, Stalin's daughter, and Vasily, his alcoholic son, were summoned to the Dacha. Vasily paced the halls, drunkenly screaming that the doctors were murdering his father, while Svetlana sat by the bed, weeping for the complex, brutal man who had destroyed her family. The most dramatic behavior came from Lavrentiy Beria. Svetlana later recorded that Beria's face was a mirror of terrifying, unfiltered human emotions. When Stalin was unconscious, Beria openly spat on the floor, his face contorted with hatred and triumph. But at one point, Stalin suddenly opened his eyes for a brief moment. He looked around the room with a wild, furious glare. He raised his left hand, pointing upward toward the ceiling or toward the people gathered around him, as if issuing a final, terrible curse upon them all. In that terrifying second, Beria dropped to his knees, grabbed Stalin's limp hand, and began kissing it frantically, crying out fake words of devotion. The moment the eyes closed again, Beria stood up and spat once more. By the evening of March 5, 1953, the end was near. Stalin's breathing became shallow, heavy, and irregular. His face grew dark, and his lips turned blue from a lack of oxygen. The grand machine of the human body that had driven the industrialization, directed the slaughter of millions, and commanded the Red Armies across Europe was finally running out of fuel. At 9:50 p.m., Stalin's chest rose one last time, fell, and stopped. The physician checked his pulse and quietly pronounced the comrade general secretary dead. For a few long seconds, an absolute freezing silence gripped the room. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The realization that the giant, terrifying shadow that had dominated their lives for 30 years was gone forever was too immense to process. Then the silence broke. Lavrentiy Beria was the first to react. He broke away from the bed, his face lit with a manic, triumphant energy. He sprinted out of the room, his heavy boots echoing loudly down the corridor. As he reached the front door of the Dacha, he raised his fist into the air and shouted into the cold night. "The tyrant is dead. I am free. We are free." He jumped into his limousine and raced toward Moscow to seize control of the secret police files before his rivals could stop him. Behind him in the room, the remaining ministers fell to their knees, weeping tears of pure, unadulterated relief. Nikita Khrushchev stood near the window, looking out into the dark Russian forest. The man of steel, who had turned a peasant empire into a nuclear superpower through an ocean of blood and terror, had died exactly as he had lived.